The water moves slowly tonight, as it always has, as it always will. I am old now, my fingers stained with ink from countless manuscripts, my eyes dim from years of reading by candlelight. But when I close them, I see the Niger as it was in my childhood. Clear, endless, eternal. My name matters little now. I was born in Gao in the year the Christians call 1450, though we measured time differently then. By the floods, by the harvests, by the coming and going of the great trading caravans that brought salt from the north and gold from the south. I was a child of the river, as all children of Gao were children of the river. The Niger flows through my earliest memories like a gentle serpent of life. Each morning, I would wake to the sound of fishermen calling to each other across the water. Their voices carried far in the cool air before dawn. Soft voices, patient voices. The river taught patience to all who lived beside it. I remember my grandfather's hands, dark and weathered, marked with the scars of a lifetime spent working the fertile banks. He would take me to the water's edge each morning, before the sun grew too strong. We would sit on the smooth stones, worn perfect by countless seasons of flooding and drought. He would tell me stories of the great empire that had once ruled these lands. Mali, he called it, the empire of the Golden King, Mansa Musa. But that was long ago, grandfather would say. Long ago when the world was different, when the rivers ran fuller and the rains came when they should, when there was order in the land and peace in the villages. The river remembers everything, my grandfather would whisper. Every empire that has risen beside its banks, every king who has drunk from its waters, every trader who has crossed its currents. The river remembers, and the river endures. I learned to read the water as other children learned to read the faces of their parents. When the current moved slowly, brown with silt, it meant the rains had been good upstream. When it ran clear and fast, it meant drought in the highlands. When it rose suddenly, foaming and angry, it meant the gods were displeased with something, somewhere, and we must prepare for change. Change was coming even then, though I was too young to understand it. The great Mali Empire was dying. Not quickly, like a man struck by lightning, but slowly, like a tree whose roots have been eaten by termites. The center could no longer hold. The provinces grew restless. The trade routes that had made Mali rich were being taken by others. In Gao, we felt this decline in small ways. The tax collectors came less often. The governors sent from the capital grew lazier, more corrupt. The great mosque that had been built with Mali gold began to crumble, its walls stained with the marks of neglect. The market that had once been full of merchants from across the known world grew quieter, emptier. But the river flowed on. Always the river flowed on. My father was a scribe, one of the few in Gao who could read both Arabic and the local tongues. He worked for the governor, recording tax collections, trade agreements, legal judgments. Each evening, he would return home with his fingers stained black from ink, his eyes tired from squinting at difficult documents. He would sit by the oil lamp and practice his letters, muttering under his breath. Knowledge is power, he would tell me, but knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. The wise man knows when to speak and when to remain silent. The wise man knows when to act and when to wait. The wise man knows that empires rise and fall like the flooding of the river, but the river itself endures. I would watch him work, copying passages from old books, preserving the wisdom of scholars who had died before I was born. His hand was steady, his letters perfectly formed. Each word was a small work of art, each sentence a bridge between the past and the future. I wanted to be like him. I wanted to preserve knowledge, to be a keeper of memories. The house where I grew up was simple, built of mud brick and timber like all the houses in Gao. But it was filled with books, scrolls and bound volumes, some written in Arabic, others in languages I did not recognize. My father had collected them over years, trading for them, copying them, protecting them from the dampness of the rainy season and the dryness of the harmattan winds. At night, when the work was done and the evening meal finished, my father would read to us stories of the Prophet, peace be upon him, tales of the great scholars of Baghdad and Cairo, chronicles of the kings of old, their victories and defeats, their wisdom and their folly. The words would flow like water, carrying us to distant lands and distant times. But the stories I loved best were the ones about the river itself. How it had been formed by the breath of Allah, flowing from the mountains of the west to the great bend at Timbuktu, then south and east through Gao and on to the sea. How it had witnessed the rise of Ghana, the empire of gold and iron. How it had nourished Mali in its greatness. How it would outlast all earthly kingdoms, flowing on until the day of judgment. The river was our calendar, our clock, our constant companion. In the dry season, from October to May, it ran low and clear. The fishermen would wade far out from shore, their nets spread wide, their voices calling across the narrow channels. The hippos would emerge from the deeper pools, their eyes and nostrils just above the surface, watching us with ancient patience. Children would play in the shallows, splashing and laughing. The water was warm then, heated by the sun, safe from the crocodiles that lurked in the deeper places. We would dive for stones, compete to see who could hold their breath longest, race from one bank to the other. The river was our playground, our teacher, our friend. When the rains came, usually in June, the river would begin to rise. Slowly at first, then faster, until the muddy water overflowed its banks and spread across the floodplain. The fishermen would bring their boats to higher ground. The farmers would watch anxiously, hoping for enough water to nourish their crops but not so much as to wash them away. The flood brought life to the land. When the waters receded, they left behind rich silt, perfect for growing millet and sorghum, rice and vegetables. The cattle would return to graze on the new grass. The birds would come in great flocks, feeding on the fish trapped in the temporary pools. The cycle of life would begin again. I learned to swim before I could properly walk. My mother would hold me in the shallows, her hands supporting my small body as I kicked and splashed. The water was warm, welcoming, safe. It held me like a mother's embrace, teaching me to trust, to float, to move with the current rather than against it. The fishermen were my first teachers in the ways of the river. Old men mostly, their skin darkened by years of sun and wind, their hands skilled in the casting of nets and the reading of water. They would take me in their boats, show me where the fish liked to hide, teach me to recognize the signs of weather change in the color of the water and the behavior of the birds. Each fish had its season, its preferred depth, its own secret habits. The catfish that lurked in the muddy bottom during the day but came to the surface at night to feed. The small silver fish that schooled in the shallows when the water was rising. The large perch that could only be caught with the strongest lines and the sharpest hooks. The river gave us everything we needed. Fish for food, water for drinking and cooking, clay for making pots and bricks. The reeds that grew along the banks provided material for baskets and mats. The papyrus could be made into paper for writing. Even the crocodiles, dangerous as they were, provided leather for shields and sandals. But the river was not just a provider. It was a highway, a connection to the wider world. Boats came from upstream, from the Great Bend at Timbuktu, carrying salt from the mines of Tagaza and books from the scholars of Sankor. They brought news of the wider world, stories of distant lands, goods that could not be found in our local markets. Downstream, the boats carried gold from the mines of Bambuk, slaves captured in raids to the south, ivory from the elephants of the forest regions. The river was a river of wealth, of knowledge, of power. Those who controlled it controlled the heartland of Africa. I would stand on the banks for hours watching the boats pass. Great vessels with triangular sails, their hulls heavy with cargo. Smaller craft powered by oars, their crews singing work songs to keep time. Dugout canoes carrying fishermen to their secret spots. Each vessel was a story, a journey, a connection between here and there. The boat crews were men of many nations. Arabs from the north, their skin pale, their clothes fine. Berbers from the desert, their faces veiled against the sand. Sonic traders from the west, their speech quick and clever. Hausa merchants from the east, their pack animals laden with goods. All of them drawn to the river, united by the river, made wealthy by the river. In the evenings, when the work was done and the sun was setting, the whole community would gather by the water. The men would discuss the day's business, the price of goods, the news from other places. The women would wash clothes and dishes, their laughter mixing with the sound of water lapping against the shore. The children would play games, their voices carrying across the water like bird songs. The imam would call the faithful to prayer, his voice echoing from the minaret of the mosque. We would line up facing east, toward Mecca, toward the holy city that seemed so far away. But the river flowed east too, toward the sea, toward the wider world. In prayer, we were connected to all Muslims everywhere. By the river, we were connected to all the peoples of the Sudan. My childhood was measured in these moments. The slow passage of days marked by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing of the seasons, the coming and going of the trading caravans. Life moved at the pace of the river, steady and sure, without haste but without rest. The market of Gao was where the river met the desert. Here, the salt caravans from the north would meet the gold traders from the south. Here, the scholars of Timbuktu would buy books from Cairo and Baghdad. Here, the news of the world would be shared over cups of tea and bowls of millet porridge. I would follow my father to the market, watching as he negotiated with merchants, witnessed contracts, recorded transactions. The market was a school of languages, a university of commerce. Arabic was the language of learning and law. Fulfulde was spoken by the cattle herders. Hausa was the tongue of the eastern traders. Mandinka was the language of the old Mali Empire. Songhai was our own language, the language of the river people. Each language carried its own wisdom, its own way of seeing the world. The Arabs spoke of God and scholarship. The Fulbe talked of cattle and grass. The Hausa discussed trade and profit. The Mandinka remembered the glory of Mali. The Songhai understood the rhythms of the river. I learned them all, slowly, patiently, the way the river learns the shape of its banks. Each new word was a tool, each new phrase a key to understanding. Language was power, my father taught me. The man who could speak to everyone was the man who could trade with everyone, learn from everyone, lead everyone. The old men of Gao would gather in the shade of the great baobab tree that grew near the mosque. They would drink tea and talk of the old days, when Mali was strong and the trade routes were safe. They remembered Mansa Musa, the golden king who had made the pilgrimage to Mecca with so much gold that the price of the metal fell for 10 years. They spoke of the great cities of the empire, Timbuktu, Djenne, Walata, Gao itself. But those days were passing, they would say, shaking their grizzled heads. The empire was breaking apart. The provinces were declaring independence. The trade routes were being raided by bandits. The kings in the capital were weak, more interested in their own comfort than in the welfare of their people. Change was coming, they would whisper. Change was always coming. The river brought change with each flood, each drought, each shift in its course. The desert brought change with each caravan, each raid, each new ruler. The world beyond the river brought change with each season, each war, each rise and fall of distant empires. But the river endured. The river always endured. As I grew older, I began to understand what the old men meant. The tax collectors came less often to Gao. The governors sent from the capital were weaker, more corrupt. The great mosque began to crumble from neglect. The market grew quieter as fewer caravans came through. The empire was dying, slowly but surely, like a great tree whose roots had been eaten by termites. Yet life went on. The river still flowed. The fish still swam. The farmers still planted their crops when the floods came. The children still played in the shallows. The muezzin still called the faithful to prayer. The sun still rose in the east and set in the west. The basic rhythms of life continued, whatever empires rose and fell. I was 15 when I first heard the name Sunni Ali. A fisherman brought the news from upstream, from the region of Djenne. A new leader had emerged among the Songhai people. A warrior, they said. A man who could fight like a lion and think like a serpent. A man who claimed descent from the ancient kings of Gao. The river carries all news eventually. Stories flowed downstream like debris after a flood. Sunni Ali was gathering followers. He was training an army. He was preparing to restore the old Songhai kingdom. He was coming to claim his inheritance. My father listened to these stories with interest but without excitement. He had heard such tales before. Young men with big dreams and small armies. Would-be kings who conquered a village or two before disappearing into the dust of history. The river had seen many such pretenders come and go. But something was different about Sunni Ali. The stories about him were different. They spoke not just of his military skill but of his magic. They said he could transform himself into a vulture and fly above his enemies. They said he could make himself invisible in battle. They said he could speak to the spirits of the river and command their aid. Magic or not, the stories multiplied. Sunni Ali had defeated the Mossi raiders who had been troubling the southern borders. He had captured the city of Timbuktu from the Tuaregs who had held it for 30 years. He was marching on Djenne, the great trading city that had never been taken by force. He was coming to Gao to claim the throne of his ancestors. The river brought these stories to us, and the river would soon bring the man himself. Change was coming to the land of the Songhai. The empire of Mali was dying, but something new was being born in its place. Something that would rise from the waters of the Niger like a great crocodile, ancient and powerful and patient. I was still a child then, still learning to read and write, still helping my father in his work as a scribe. But I sensed that I was living at the end of one age and the beginning of another. The old world was passing away. The new world was being born. And I would live to see it all, to record it all, to preserve the memory of these great changes for future generations. The river flowed on, carrying the old world toward the sea and bringing the new world down from the mountains. And I, a child of the river, would flow with it, wherever it might lead. The water moves slowly tonight, as it always has, as it always will. But in that slow movement, I can hear the echo of distant drums, the whisper of approaching armies, the promise of great deeds yet to come. The river remembers everything, and tonight it remembers the coming of Sunni Ali.
Перша частина завершена. Готовій до продовження.
Part 2. The Decline of Mali and the Growing Chaos. The years that followed brought darkness to our land. Not the gentle darkness of night, when the river reflects the stars and the world rests in peaceful slumber, but the harsh darkness of uncertainty, of fear, of a great empire slowly crumbling like mud bricks in the rain. I was 16 when the last governor of Mali left Gao. He departed in the night, like a thief, taking with him what remained of the imperial treasury and leaving behind only empty promises and unpaid debts. The Great Seal of Mali, which had legitimized trade agreements and legal decisions for generations, was gone. The imperial banner that had flown over the governor's palace was torn down. We were orphans now, abandoned by the empire that had once called us its children. The river still flowed, but the world around it had changed. Without the strong hand of imperial authority, the delicate balance that had maintained peace in our region began to collapse. The Tuaregs, those veiled warriors of the desert, grew bolder in their raids. The Mossi cavalry struck deeper into our territories. River pirates, who had once been kept in check by imperial patrols, began to prey on merchant vessels with impunity. My father's work changed too. Where once he had recorded the orderly proceedings of imperial administration, now he found himself documenting chaos. Disputes between merchants that had no legal authority to resolve them. Contracts that could not be enforced. Taxes that were collected by whoever had the strongest arm, not necessarily the legitimate authority. The great mosque of Gao fell into disrepair. Its walls, once maintained by imperial funds, began to crack and crumble. The call to prayer still echoed 5 times daily, but the voice of the muezzin seemed smaller somehow, less certain, as if even God's presence had grown distant in these troubled times. Trade, the lifeblood of our river city, began to slow. The great caravans that had once brought salt from Tagaza and gold from Bambuk now traveled with larger armed escorts. And even then, many chose to avoid Gao altogether. The market that had once bustled with merchants from across the known world grew quieter, emptier. Stalls that had been passed down through generations stood abandoned. Their owners fled to safer places. The fishermen still went out each morning, but they carried spears now as well as nets. River pirates had become as dangerous as crocodiles, and more unpredictable. The women still went to the river to wash clothes and draw water, but they traveled in groups, watchful and nervous. Children still played by the water's edge, but their games had changed. They played at being soldiers now, at fighting raiders, at defending their homes. I remember the morning when everything changed for my family. It was the dry season, and the river ran low and clear. The hippos had emerged from the deeper pools and were grazing on the banks, their massive forms moving with surprising grace through the shallows. It should have been a peaceful scene, but there was tension in the air, a feeling that something was wrong. A rider came from the north, his horse lathered with sweat, his clothes torn by thorns. He brought news that chilled our hearts. Timbuktu had fallen. The great city of scholars and merchants, the jewel of the Mali Empire, had been captured by Tuareg raiders. The University of Sankore, where the finest minds of Africa had gathered for centuries, was in the hands of nomads who valued swords above books. My father received this news in silence, his face grave. Timbuktu was more than just a city. It was a symbol. If Timbuktu could fall, if the great center of learning and trade could be taken by a handful of desert warriors, then nothing was safe. The empire that had seemed eternal was revealed to be as fragile as a house of cards in the Harmattan wind. The merchant families of Gao began to make plans. Some spoke of fleeing south, to the forest kingdoms where the raiders could not easily follow. Others talked of traveling east, to the Hausa cities that still maintained their independence. A few even considered the dangerous journey north, across the desert to the Maghreb, where the Islamic kingdoms of Morocco and Tunisia might offer protection. But most stayed. The river was their home, their livelihood, their identity. They had been born beside its waters, and they would die beside its waters if necessary. They would endure whatever came, as their ancestors had endured drought and flood, war and peace, the rise and fall of empires. The old men who gathered beneath the baobab tree spoke now of darker things. They remembered other times of trouble, other periods when the great empires had weakened and the land had fallen into chaos. They spoke of the time before Ghana, when the desert peoples had raided at will. They remembered the interregnum between Ghana and Mali, when every village had been a fortress and every farmer a warrior. History moves in cycles, they said, like the flooding of the river. Empires rise and fall, order gives way to chaos, chaos gives way to order. The wheel turns, and what was up comes down, what was down comes up. The wise man does not despair in bad times, for he knows that good times will come again. The wise man does not rejoice too much in good times, for he knows that bad times will follow. But knowing this did not make the present troubles easier to bear. The raids grew more frequent and more destructive. The Tuaregs struck from the north, their camels swift and silent across the desert sands. The Mossi came from the south, their horses thundering across the savannah. River pirates attacked merchant vessels in broad daylight, caring nothing for the ancient customs that had protected trade for generations. The young men of Gao began to organize themselves into militia units. They had no formal training, no proper weapons, no experienced leaders. But they had courage and desperation, and these are sometimes enough. They practiced with spears and bows in the fields outside the city. They learned to move together, to fight together, to die together if necessary. My father was too old to fight, but he contributed in other ways. He used his knowledge of writing to help organize the militia, to keep records of weapons and supplies, to correspond with other cities that faced similar threats. His scribal skills, once used to record the peaceful transactions of trade, now served the harsh necessities of war. I wanted to join the militia, to take up spear and shield in defense of my city. But my father forbade it. Your weapon is not the spear, he told me. Your weapon is the pen. Warriors die in battle, but scribes preserve the memory of their deeds. Someone must record what happens here. Someone must remember. So I watched from the sidelines as my city prepared for war. I saw the militia training in the fields. I heard the discussions of strategy and tactics. I felt the fear and determination that gripped every heart. And I wrote it all down as my father had taught me, preserving the memories for future generations. The first real battle came in the spring, when the river was beginning to rise. A large Tuareg force had appeared on the northern horizon, their veiled forms shimmering in the heat haze. They came not as raiders but as conquerors, with siege equipment and supply trains, clearly intending to take and hold the city. The militia of Gao met them on the plain north of the city, where the desert met the river valley. I watched from the walls as the two forces clashed. The Tuaregs were skilled warriors, veteran fighters who had conquered Timbuktu and a dozen other cities. Our militia were farmers and fishermen, merchants and craftsmen, brave but inexperienced. The battle was brief and decisive. The Tuaregs swept through our ranks like a sandstorm, their camels and horses trampling the foot soldiers, their spears and swords cutting down all who stood before them. Within an hour it was over. The militia of Gao was broken, scattered, defeated. The survivors fled back to the city, and the Tuaregs followed close behind. The siege that followed lasted 3 months. The Tuaregs surrounded the city, cutting off all trade and communication with the outside world. They had siege engines, battering rams, and scaling ladders. They had the patience of desert dwellers, accustomed to long waits for water and prey. They had the confidence of victors, knowing that time was on their side. Inside the city, life became a daily struggle for survival. Food ran short, then shorter. The wells that had always provided fresh water began to run dry. Disease spread through the crowded quarters where families huddled together for protection. The old and the weak died first, as they always do in times of hardship. My father aged 10 years in those 3 months. His hair turned white, his hands trembled, his eyes grew dim. But he continued his work, recording the events of the siege, preserving the testimony of witnesses, maintaining the written record of our suffering. Someone must remember, he would say, his voice barely a whisper. Someone must tell the story. The end came suddenly, as ends often do. A section of the city wall, weakened by constant bombardment, collapsed in the night. The Tuaregs poured through the breach like water through a broken dam. There was no organized resistance, no heroic last stand. Just chaos, terror, and the sound of running feet on cobblestones. We survived by hiding in the cellar of our house, listening to the sounds of conquest above. The screams of the wounded, the crash of breaking pottery, the harsh voices of the conquerors as they looted and pillaged. We stayed hidden for 3 days, emerging only when the sounds of violence had died down and the city had fallen into the eerie quiet of defeat. Gao under Tuareg rule was a different place. The great mosque was turned into a stable for their camels. The market was reorganized to serve their needs, not ours. The river port was fortified to prevent any attempt at liberation from the water. The language of command was now Tamashek, the tongue of the desert, not Arabic or Songhai. But the river flowed on as it always had. The fish still swam in its depths. The hippos still emerged to graze on its banks. The birds still came in great flocks during the migration season. Nature continued its eternal cycles, indifferent to the human dramas played out on its shores. The Tuareg occupation was harsh but not cruel. They were practical men, interested in tribute and trade routes rather than in the systematic oppression of the population. They allowed the daily life of the city to continue, as long as their authority was acknowledged and their taxes were paid. They even allowed the call to prayer to resume, though the imam now spoke words of submission to the new rulers. My father was kept on as a scribe, his skills too valuable to waste. But now he worked for Tuareg administrators, recording their decisions, translating their orders, helping them to understand the complex systems of trade and taxation that had developed over generations. He did this work without enthusiasm but without resistance, understanding that cooperation was the price of survival. I continued my education, learning now to read and write in Tamashek as well as Arabic and Songhai. Knowledge was survival, my father reminded me. The man who could serve any master was the man who could survive any conquest. Empires might come and go, but the need for scribes was eternal. The years of Tuareg rule were years of stagnation. Trade continued, but at a reduced level. The great caravans that had once made Gao wealthy now bypassed the city, finding safer routes to the south. The population slowly declined as families left for other places, seeking better opportunities or simply escape from the atmosphere of defeat. I watched my city slowly dying and felt powerless to stop it. The river still flowed, but the life it had once nourished was ebbing away. The buildings began to show signs of neglect. The streets grew quieter. The market stalls stood empty. Even the children seemed less numerous, less joyful in their play. It was during this dark time that the first rumors began to reach us. Stories from the south, from the region of Djenne, spoke of a new leader rising among the Songhai people. A man who claimed descent from the ancient kings of Gao. A warrior magician who could transform himself into a vulture and fly above his enemies. A leader who promised to restore the old kingdom and drive out the invaders. His name was Sunni Ali, and the river brought us whispers of his growing power. He had united the scattered Songhai clans. He had defeated the Mossy raiders who had troubled the southern borders. He had captured several cities from their Tuareg garrisons. He was gathering an army, training warriors, preparing for a great campaign. The Tuareg administrators in Gao heard these rumors too, but they dismissed them as wishful thinking. They had seen would-be liberators before, young men with big dreams and small armies. The desert had swallowed them all, as it would swallow the Sunni Ali if he dared to challenge their authority. But something was different about these rumors. They came not from single sources but from many. Not just from Songhai territories but from across the region. Traders spoke of unusual movements in the south. Refugees told stories of a leader who fought like a lion and thought like a serpent. Even the desert nomads whispered of strange portents, of signs and wonders that foretold great changes. The river carried these stories to us, and with them came hope. Not the desperate hope of the drowning man who grasps at straws, but the steady hope of the farmer who sees clouds gathering on the horizon. Change was coming. The wheel of history was turning. The long night of occupation might soon be ending. I was 24 when Sunni Ali first appeared on the horizon. A dust cloud to the south, moving slowly but steadily toward our city. The Tuareg garrison prepared for battle, confident in their strength and their experience. They had held Gao for 8 years. They had defeated every challenger. They saw no reason why this one should be different. But as the dust cloud drew closer, something in the air changed. The very atmosphere seemed to tremble with anticipation. The river birds flew in unusual patterns. The fish moved restlessly in the shallows. Even the hippos seemed nervous, snorting and splashing more than usual. The old men who gathered beneath the baobab tree spoke in whispers now. They remembered stories their grandfathers had told them, stories of the ancient kings of Gao who had ruled before the coming of Mali. They spoke of prophecies and portents, of dreams and visions that foretold the return of the Songhai kingdom. The river knows, they said. The river remembers. The river has been waiting for this moment for 30 years, ever since the last Songhai king was defeated and the realm was absorbed into the Mali Empire. Now the time of waiting was over. The rightful heir was coming home. As the dust cloud approached, I climbed to the highest tower of the city walls. From there, I could see the approaching army spread out across the plain. It was larger than any force I had ever seen, a great mass of men and horses moving with purpose and discipline. At its head rode a figure in white robes, his face hidden by a veil, his banner streaming in the wind. Sunni Ali had come to claim his inheritance. The river had brought him home, as it brings all things home in the end. The wheel of history was turning, and with it the fate of our city, our people, our world. The water moves slowly tonight, carrying with it the memory of that moment when hope returned to our land. The river remembers everything, and tonight it remembers the coming of the king.
Друга частина завершена. Готові до продовження.
Part 3. The appearance of Sunni Ali and his first campaigns. The wind carried strange sounds that morning. Not the familiar whispers of the harmattan or the gentle sighs of the river breeze, but something else. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up and the dogs in the city begin to howl. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an energy I had never felt before. I was on the walls of Gao when I first saw him clearly. Sunni Ali, the man who would change everything. He sat his horse like he had been born in the saddle, his white robes flowing around him like water, his face hidden behind a veil that fluttered in the wind. Even at a distance, there was something about him that commanded attention, something that made it impossible to look away. The stories had not prepared me for the reality of his presence. The rumors had spoken of a warrior magician, a man who could transform himself into a vulture and fly above his enemies. They had described him as a sorcerer who could speak to the spirits of the river and command their aid. But seeing him there, at the head of his army, I understood that the truth was both simpler and more complex than the legends. He was a man, certainly, but he was a man who carried power around him like a cloak. Not the crude power of the sword or the temporary power of gold, but something deeper. Something that came from the earth itself, from the river, from the ancient spirits that had watched over this land since the beginning of time. His army was unlike anything I had ever seen. Not the disciplined ranks of the Mali Empire or the swift horsemen of the Tuareg raiders, but something entirely new. They moved like a living thing, flowing across the landscape like water, adapting to every obstacle, always maintaining their cohesion. At their center were the heavy infantry, men armed with spears and shields, their bodies protected by quilted armor that could turn aside arrows and sword strokes. On the flanks were the cavalry, riding horses that seemed to dance rather than merely run. These were not the small, hardy ponies of the desert but true war horses, bred for size and strength and speed. Their riders carried long lances and curved swords, and they moved with the fluid grace of men who had spent their lives in the saddle. But it was the archers who caught my attention most. They were arranged in loose formations behind the main battle line, their bows held ready, their quivers full of arrows. There was something about the way they stood, the way they moved, that spoke of deadly competence. These were not farmers pressed into service or young men playing at war. These were professional soldiers, veterans of many battles, men who had learned their craft in the hardest school of all. The Tuareg garrison of Gao prepared to meet them with all the confidence of men who had never known defeat. They had held the city for 8 years, beaten back every challenge, grown comfortable in their dominance. Their commander, a tall man with gray in his beard and scars on his hands, deployed his forces with the casual efficiency of long experience. The Tuaregs were formidable warriors, masters of desert warfare, skilled in the use of spear and sword and bow. They rode camels that could travel for days without water, animals that could navigate the trackless wastes of the Sahara with unerring accuracy. They wore veils that protected them from sandstorms and loose robes that allowed them to move freely in the heat of battle. But as I watched the two armies face each other across the plain north of Gao, I began to understand that this would be no ordinary battle. The very air seemed to crackle with tension. The river birds fell silent. Even the wind died down to nothing, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sunni Ali rode forward from his ranks, alone, his white robes brilliant in the morning sun. He carried no weapon that I could see, no spear or sword or bow, just a long staff topped with what looked like a bundle of feathers and bones. He raised the staff above his head and began to chant in a voice that carried across the battlefield like thunder. I could not understand the words he spoke. They were in no language I recognized, though I had learned to read and write in Arabic and Songhai and Tamashek. But I felt their power. The ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble. The walls of the city vibrated like a struck drum. And in the distance, I could hear the sound of the river rising, though the flood season was still months away. The Tuareg commander responded with his own display of power. He raised his spear and shouted challenges in the ancient tradition of his people. His voice was strong, his words brave, his manner confident. But somehow, his human voice seemed small against the elemental force that Sunni Ali had unleashed. The battle began not with the clash of weapons but with a sound like breaking glass. The air itself seemed to shatter, and through the cracks came things that should not have been possible. Birds that were not birds, flying in formations that hurt the eyes to look upon. Shadows that moved independently of the objects that cast them. And over it all, the sound of drums that no human hands were beating. The Tuareg cavalry charged first, as they always did. Their camels thundered across the plain, their riders shouting war cries that had echoed across the desert for generations. They were magnificent in their fury, terrible in their skill, overwhelming in their courage. But as they approached Sunni Ali's lines, something happened that I still do not fully understand. The very ground beneath the camel's feet began to change. What had been solid earth became soft sand, then softer, then something that was neither sand nor earth but something else entirely. The great beasts began to struggle, their sure footing suddenly uncertain. Their riders, masters of desert warfare, found themselves fighting not just human enemies but the very elements themselves. Sunni Ali's archers opened fire, and their arrows flew like a dark cloud across the morning sky. But these were not ordinary arrows. They curved and twisted in flight, seeking their targets with uncanny accuracy. They penetrated armor that should have turned them aside, found gaps in shields that should have been solid barriers. And when they struck, they did not merely wound. They burned with a cold fire that seemed to freeze the very soul. The battle was chaos, but it was chaos with a purpose. Sunni Ali's forces moved like dancers, each unit responding to signals that I could not see, commands that I could not hear. They flowed around the Tuareg attacks like water around stones, always maintaining their formation, always striking back at the perfect moment. I watched from the walls as the tide of battle turned. The Tuaregs, who had seemed invincible just moments before, began to fall back. Their camels, usually so sure-footed, stumbled and fell. Their weapons, usually so deadly, seemed to turn in their hands. Their war cries, usually so terrifying, became screams of confusion and fear. But it was not just the magic that defeated them. It was the skill and discipline of Sunni Ali's army. These men had been training for years, preparing for this moment. They knew their business, understood their roles, trusted their leaders. They fought with the calm efficiency of professionals, men who had made war their life's work. The Tuareg commander, brave to the end, led a final charge against Sunni Ali himself. He rode straight at the man in white robes, his spear held high, his voice raised in a final war cry. For a moment, it seemed that he might succeed, that pure courage might overcome whatever dark powers his enemy commanded. But Sunni Ali simply raised his staff, and the Tuareg commander's camel stopped as if it had run into an invisible wall. The beast reared up on its hind legs, its eyes rolling white with terror, its voice raised in a scream that was almost human. The rider, caught off balance, tumbled from his saddle and lay still on the ground. The battle was over. The Tuareg garrison of Gao was broken, scattered, defeated. Those who could fled into the desert, seeking refuge among their distant kinsmen. Those who could not surrender, throwing down their weapons and begging for mercy. The 8-year occupation of my city had ended in a single morning. Sunni Ali entered Gao not as a conqueror but as a liberator. The people lined the streets to welcome him, throwing flowers and shouting his name. Children ran alongside his horse, their faces bright with joy. Women ululated from the rooftops, their voices raised in the ancient songs of victory. Even the old men beneath the baobab tree stood and bowed as he passed. But I watched him carefully, this man who had liberated my city, and I saw something in his eyes that gave me pause. There was kindness there, certainly, and justice, and a deep love for his people. But there was also something else, something hard and cold and utterly ruthless. This was a man who would do whatever was necessary to achieve his goals, no matter the cost. He went first to the great mosque, where he knelt in prayer and gave thanks to Allah for his victory. But even as he prayed, I could see the fetishes and amulets that hung from his belt, the charms and talismans that spoke of older powers than those acknowledged by the Prophet. Sunni Ali was a Muslim, certainly, but he was also something more. Something that belonged to this land in ways that went deeper than any imported religion. After prayer, he went to the governor's palace, where he held court and received the submission of the city's leaders. My father was among them, offering his services as a scribe and administrator. Sunni Ali accepted graciously, but I could see him studying my father with those sharp eyes, measuring him, deciding whether he could be trusted. The new administration was established with remarkable speed. Sunni Ali had clearly planned for this moment, prepared for the details of governance as carefully as he had prepared for the details of warfare. He appointed military governors to oversee the city's defenses, civil administrators to manage trade and taxation, religious leaders to guide the spiritual life of the community. But he also did something unprecedented. He gathered the old men of the city, the keepers of tradition and memory, and asked them to tell him the ancient stories of Gao. Not the official histories of the Mali Empire or the Islamic chronicles of the scholars, but the older stories. The tales of the first kings, the legends of the river spirits, the myths that went back to the beginning of time. For 3 days and 3 nights he listened to these stories. He asked questions, demanded details, insisted on perfect accuracy. He was mapping not just the physical territory of his new kingdom but its spiritual landscape as well. He was learning the names of the ancient powers, the locations of the sacred groves, the rituals that had once been performed to ensure the river's blessing. On the 4th day he announced his plans. Gao would be rebuilt, not as it had been under the Tuaregs but as it had been in the ancient times, when the Songhai kings had ruled from this very spot. The great mosque would be restored, but so would the old shrines that had been neglected for generations. The market would be reorganized, but according to principles that went back to the founding of the city. Most importantly, he announced that this was only the beginning. Gao was just the first step in a greater campaign. He intended to restore the entire Songhai kingdom, to drive out all foreign invaders, to reunite the scattered peoples of the river under a single banner. And after that, he would do what no Songhai king had ever done before. He would build an empire that would rival Mali at its height. The people received this news with mixed emotions. Joy at their liberation, certainly. Pride in their new king, without question. But also a certain unease at the magnitude of what he proposed. Empire building meant war, and war meant suffering, even for the victors. The river had seen many empires rise and fall, and not all of them had brought peace and prosperity to their subjects. But Sunni Ali was not asking for their opinions. He was informing them of his decisions. And as I watched him that day, standing in the great square of Gao with his white robes billowing in the wind and his staff raised high above his head, I understood that this was not a man who could be argued with or deterred. This was a force of nature, as inexorable as the river itself. The army that had liberated Gao did not rest long. Within a week, they were on the march again, moving upstream toward their next target. Sunni Ali had learned that the Tuaregs were gathering their forces at Timbuktu, preparing to march south and reclaim their lost territories. He intended to strike them before they could organize their response. I begged my father to let me join the campaign as a chronicler, to record the deeds of this remarkable man for future generations. But he refused, as I knew he would. "Your time will come," he told me. "But not yet. You must learn more, grow stronger, become worthy of the task ahead. The river is patient, and you must be patient too." So I remained in Gao, helping to rebuild the city, learning the arts of administration and governance. But every day, I climbed to the walls and looked upstream, toward the bend in the river where Sunni Ali had disappeared with his army. And every day, I wondered what deeds were being done in the name of our new king, what victories were being won, what enemies were being defeated. The river brought us news as it always did. Traders and travelers, refugees and messengers, all with stories to tell. Sunni Ali had struck the Tuaregs at Timbuktu with the speed of lightning. The city had fallen in a single day. The University of Sankor was restored to its proper function. The scholars who had fled during the occupation were returning, bringing with them the precious books and manuscripts that preserved the wisdom of ages. But the stories also spoke of Sunni Ali's methods, and these were more troubling. Cities that resisted were destroyed utterly, their populations scattered to the winds. Leaders who opposed him were executed publicly, their heads displayed as warnings to others. He showed mercy to those who submitted quickly, but none to those who defied him. The river carried these stories to every corner of the region, and with them came a new understanding. The age of chaos was ending, but the age of Sunni Ali would be no less dangerous. He was creating order, certainly, but it was an order enforced by fear as much as by love. He was building a kingdom, but it was a kingdom where his will was law and his word was final. Yet the people accepted this, even welcomed it. After years of anarchy, even harsh order was preferable to chaos. After years of foreign occupation, even a terrible king was better than no king at all. The river had taught them patience, but it had also taught them pragmatism. They would serve Sunni Ali as they had served the Tuaregs, as they had served the governors of Mali, as they would serve whoever came after him. But I sensed that Sunni Ali would not be easily replaced. This was not a man who had stumbled into power or inherited it from his fathers. This was a man who had seized destiny with both hands and bent it to his will. He had the river's blessing, the spirit's favor, the people's fear, and the warrior's loyalty. He was building something that would outlast him, something that would endure long after his white robes had turned to dust. The water moves slowly tonight, carrying with it the memory of that first victory, that first glimpse of the man who would reshape our world. The river remembers everything, and tonight, it remembers the day when chaos ended and a new age began. Part 4. The Unification of Lands under Sunni Ali. The seasons turned like the pages of a great book, each one bringing new chapters in the story of Sunni Ali's conquests. I was 25 when the full scope of his ambitions became clear to me, when I understood that he was not merely reclaiming the ancient Songhai kingdom but creating something entirely new, something larger, more powerful, more enduring than anything that had come before. The news came to Gao with the regularity of the river's floods. City after city fell to his armies. Kingdom after kingdom submitted to his rule. The Mossi, those fierce cavalry warriors who had raided our borders for generations, were crushed in a single campaign. The Dogon, who had thought themselves safe in their cliffside fortresses, were brought down from their heights and made to kneel before the new king. Even the proud Fulani, masters of the great cattle herds, bent their necks to his yoke. But it was not conquest alone that built Sunni Ali's empire. It was the art of transformation, the skill of taking defeated enemies and making them into loyal subjects. I watched this process unfold in Gao itself as former Tuareg soldiers were integrated into our garrison, as foreign merchants were welcomed into our markets, as the children of conquered peoples learned to speak Songhai alongside their native tongues. The king understood something that many conquerors do not, that an empire built on fear alone cannot endure. Fear may compel submission, but only justice can inspire loyalty. And so, even as his armies spread terror across the land, his administrators brought order, his judges brought fairness, his priests brought spiritual comfort to the conquered. I remember the day when the first delegation of Hausa merchants arrived in Gao. They came not as conquered subjects but as partners in trade, seeking to establish commercial relationships with the new power in the West. Their leader, a dignified man with silver in his beard and wisdom in his eyes, met with Sunni Ali in the great hall of the palace. I was there, serving as one of the scribes who recorded the proceedings. The merchant spoke of the great cities of Hausaland, Kano with its famous dyed cloth, Katsina with its leather goods, Zaria with its skilled metalworkers. He offered to open trade routes, to facilitate the exchange of goods and ideas, to create prosperity for both peoples. Sunni Ali listened carefully, his face hidden behind the veil he always wore in public. When the merchant finished speaking, the king was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned forward and spoke in a voice that carried the authority of thunder. "You speak of trade as if it were a favor you grant to us," he said. "But you are wrong. Trade is a river that flows both ways. It enriches those who direct its current and drowns those who stand in its path. We welcome your goods, your gold, your wisdom. But understand this, the river now flows from Gao. All who would drink from its waters must acknowledge its source." The merchant bowed low, understanding the message. The new empire would not be a passive partner in trade but an active director of it. The routes that had once been controlled by Mali, then disrupted by the Tuaregs, would now be managed by Songhai, and all who used them would pay tribute to the king who guaranteed their safety. This was the pattern that emerged across the growing empire. Sunni Ali did not simply conquer territories. He integrated them into a new economic system. The salt mines of Tagaza, the gold fields of Bambuk, the copper deposits of the Air Mountains, all became part of a vast network of production and exchange. The river cities became ports in this inland sea of commerce, each one specializing in different goods and services. The military organization that made this possible was unlike anything Africa had seen before. Sunni Ali had learned from every enemy he had faced. From the Tuaregs, he adopted their swift mobility and their knowledge of desert warfare. From the Mossi, he took their disciplined cavalry charges and their use of iron weapons. From the settled peoples of the river, he borrowed their knowledge of siege warfare and their ability to coordinate large-scale operations. But the true innovation was in the organization itself. Unlike the traditional African armies, which were assembled for specific campaigns and then disbanded, Sunni Ali created a permanent military force. Professional soldiers who served year-round, who trained constantly, who developed loyalty not just to their clans or their cities but to the empire itself. The core of this army was the royal guard, men chosen for their skill and their absolute devotion to the king. They lived in barracks near the palace, ate at the royal table, wore uniforms that marked them as the elite of the elite. Their weapons were the finest that the empire's smiths could produce. Their armor was decorated with gold and silver. Their horses were the swiftest breeds available. But the true strength of the army lay in its diversity. Infantry from the river cities, cavalry from the savannah, archers from the forest regions, engineers from the desert towns. Each group brought their own skills, their own traditions, their own ways of fighting. Under Sunni Ali's leadership, these diverse elements were welded into a single, unified force. I watched this process unfold during my frequent visits to the military camps outside Gao. The training was relentless, the discipline harsh, the standards impossibly high. But the results were undeniable. These men moved like dancers, fought like lions, obeyed like dogs. They had been transformed from a collection of tribal warriors into something new, soldiers of the empire. The key to this transformation was Sunni Ali himself. He was not a distant ruler who commanded from a palace throne. He was a warrior king who led from the front, who shared the dangers and hardships of his men, who rewarded courage and punished cowardice with equal measure. His soldiers did not serve him out of fear alone but out of love, out of respect, out of the deep loyalty that comes from shared suffering and shared triumph. The siege of Djenne demonstrated this perfectly. The great trading city, built on an island in the Niger's floodplain, had never been taken by force. Its walls were strong, its position nearly impregnable, its people skilled in the arts of defense. Previous conquerors had besieged it for months, even years, without success. But Sunni Ali approached the problem differently. Instead of trying to take the city by storm, he surrounded it completely and settled down to wait. His engineers diverted the river's flow, gradually lowering the water level around the island. His cavalry patrolled the surrounding countryside, preventing any supplies from reaching the defenders. His archers kept up a constant rain of arrows, making it impossible for the people of Djenne to move freely within their own walls. But the masterstroke came when he discovered the city's secret water supply. Djenne's inhabitants had always boasted that they could withstand any siege because they had access to fresh water from wells within the city. What they did not know was that these wells were fed by underground springs that could be blocked. Sunni Ali's engineers, working in secret, dammed these springs far upstream. It took months of careful work, but gradually the water level in Djenne's wells began to drop. The proud city that had never been conquered by force was brought to its knees by thirst. The surrender was negotiated not by the city's military leaders but by its merchants and scholars. They understood that further resistance was useless, that the king who could redirect rivers and control the very sources of water was not a man to be defied. They opened their gates and welcomed Sunni Ali as their new lord. But again, he showed the wisdom that set him apart from other conquerors. Djenne was not destroyed or even significantly damaged. Its people were not enslaved or exiled. Instead, the city was integrated into the empire as a center of learning and trade. Its famous mud-brick architecture was preserved and enhanced. Its scholars were invited to join the royal court. Its merchants were given new opportunities to expand their businesses. The pattern was repeated across the empire. Resistance was met with overwhelming force, but submission was rewarded with integration and prosperity. The king understood that an empire built on ruins could not endure, that true strength came from the willing cooperation of diverse peoples working toward common goals. The administrative system that emerged from this approach was remarkably sophisticated. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by a representative of the king. These provincial governors were not chosen from the local nobility but were career administrators, men who had proven their loyalty and competence through service to the crown. They were moved regularly from one province to another, preventing them from developing local power bases that might threaten royal authority. Below the provincial level, traditional local leaders were maintained but under imperial supervision. Village chiefs, clan elders, and town councils continued to govern their communities as they always had. But now they answered to imperial officials who ensured that imperial law was followed and imperial taxes were collected. The legal system was equally innovative. Instead of imposing a single code of law across the empire, Sunni Ali allowed different regions to maintain their traditional customs and practices, as long as they did not conflict with imperial interests. But over this patchwork of local laws, he established a uniform system of imperial justice that dealt with crimes against the state, disputes between people of different regions, and matters of trade and commerce. The result was a legal framework that was both flexible and unified, that respected local traditions while ensuring imperial authority. It was administered by a professional class of judges and lawyers who were trained in the capital and then assigned to courts throughout the empire. These men became the backbone of imperial administration, the human links that connected the capital to the most remote provinces. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Sunni Ali's empire was its religious policy. Unlike many conquerors who imposed their own beliefs on conquered peoples, the king adopted a policy of careful tolerance. He was himself a Muslim, and Islam was the official religion of the empire. But he also recognized the power of traditional beliefs and practices, and he was careful not to alienate those who held them. The result was a form of religious syncretism that would have been impossible in a more rigidly orthodox state. Islamic prayers were said in the great mosques of the cities, but traditional rituals were performed in the sacred groves of the countryside. The king himself participated in both, wearing the robes of a Muslim ruler in public but consulting with traditional priests and diviners in private. This policy was not without its critics. Orthodox Muslims complained that the king was corrupting the faith by mixing it with paganism. Traditional believers worried that their ancient practices were being subordinated to foreign influences. But Sunni Ali navigated these tensions with remarkable skill, maintaining his authority with both groups while playing them off against each other when necessary. The economic benefits of this unified empire were enormous. Trade routes that had been disrupted by decades of warfare were restored and expanded. The great trans-Saharan caravan routes, which had once terminated at the scattered cities of the western Sudan, now converged on the imperial capital of Gao. Gold from the southern mines flowed north to the Mediterranean markets. Salt from the Saharan deposits moved south to the forest regions. Slaves, ivory, and exotic goods from the deeper parts of Africa were channeled through the empire's trading networks. But the empire was not just a conduit for trade. It was a creator of wealth. Imperial workshops produced textiles, metalwork, and leather goods that were prized throughout the Muslim world. Imperial farms, made possible by expanded irrigation systems, produced surpluses that supported growing urban populations. Imperial mines, developed using new techniques learned from foreign experts, yielded unprecedented quantities of gold and copper. The wealth generated by this economic expansion was used to fund further military campaigns, to build new cities and fortifications, to support the growing bureaucracy that administered the empire. But it was also used for purposes that revealed the king's broader vision. Schools were established in major cities, libraries were built and stocked with books from across the Islamic world, mosques and other religious buildings were constructed in the finest architectural styles. The empire that Sunni Ali built was not just a military and economic achievement. It was a cultural one as well. The diversity of peoples and traditions that had been brought together under imperial rule created a new synthesis, a new form of African civilization that drew on all the traditions of the continent while creating something entirely new. I saw this synthesis taking shape in the streets of Gao itself. The city had grown enormously during the years of conquest, its population swelled by immigrants from all parts of the empire. The market that had once been a quiet local affair now buzzed with activity as merchants from dozens of different cultures hawked their wares. The great mosque, restored and expanded, now echoed with prayers in multiple languages. The palace, rebuilt in the grand style befitting an imperial capital, housed courtiers and officials from every corner of the known world. But it was in the evening, when the work was done and the city settled into its nightly rhythms, that the true nature of this new civilization became apparent. In the courtyards and gardens, in the tea houses and private homes, people from different backgrounds mingled freely. They shared stories, exchanged ideas, learned from each other. They were creating something new, something that had never existed before in Africa or anywhere else. The river that flowed past the city carried this new civilization with it, spreading its influence far beyond the borders of the empire itself. Trade routes carried not just goods but ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The administrative techniques developed in Gao were adopted by other kingdoms. The military innovations pioneered by Sunni Ali's armies were copied by other rulers. The religious synthesis that emerged in the empire influenced Islamic practice throughout the Western Sudan. As I watched this transformation unfold, I understood that I was witnessing one of those rare moments in history when the world changes forever. The empire that Sunni Ali was building would not just dominate the Western Sudan for a few decades and then fade away. It would create new patterns of thought and organization that would influence the region for centuries to come. The water moves slowly tonight, carrying with it the memory of those years of expansion and integration. The river remembers everything, and tonight, it remembers the birth of an empire that would reshape the face of Africa forever. Part 5. The Death of Sunni Ali and the Rise of Askia Muhammad. The year the Christians call 1492 brought strange omens to our land. The river ran lower than anyone could remember, even in the dry season. The rains came late and ended early. The birds migrated in patterns that confused the oldest hunters. Even the hippos seemed restless, bellowing through the nights as if they sensed some approaching catastrophe. I was 37 then, old enough to recognize the signs but young enough to hope they meant nothing. I had served as a scribe in the imperial administration for over a decade, recording the steady expansion of Sunni Ali's empire, documenting the wealth that flowed through our capital like the river itself. But that year something felt different. The very air seemed charged with anticipation, as if the world was holding its breath. Sunni Ali had been campaigning in the south, extending his authority over the forest peoples who had never known foreign rule. The messages that reached us spoke of victory after victory, of new provinces added to the empire, of tribute caravans laden with gold and ivory making their way north to Gao. But between the lines of these official dispatches, I sensed something else. A weariness, perhaps, a sense that even this great king was feeling the weight of his endless campaigns. The news came with the Harmattan winds, carried by a messenger whose horse had died beneath him in his haste to reach the capital. Sunni Ali was dead. The man who had seemed immortal, who had conquered kingdoms and commanded the very elements, had fallen not in battle but from fever. He had died in his tent beside a muddy stream, far from the river that had nurtured him, far from the city that had proclaimed him king. The messenger's words fell on the palace like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and fear in all directions. The great king was dead. The empire he had built with blood and will and magic was suddenly rudderless, drifting on currents that no one could predict or control. In the days that followed, I watched the capital convulse with uncertainty. The royal guard maintained order in the streets, but their eyes held the same fear I saw in every face. Without Sunni Ali's iron hand to guide it, would the empire hold together? Would the conquered peoples remain loyal to his successors? Would the generals who had served him faithfully now compete for power among themselves? The funeral was held with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a great king. The body was brought back to Gao on a river barge draped in white cloth, accompanied by a flotilla of smaller vessels carrying the mourners and the military escort. The entire city turned out to watch the procession, their faces etched with grief and apprehension. But even in death, Sunni Ali remained controversial. The Orthodox Muslims among his subjects had never fully accepted his blending of Islamic and traditional practices. They whispered that he had been a sorcerer, a man who had trafficked with demons and spirits. They suggested that his death was divine punishment for his heterodox beliefs. They questioned whether such a man deserved to be buried in the Muslim cemetery, whether his soul would find peace in the afterlife. The traditional believers, on the other hand, saw his death as proof of his power. They claimed that he had not truly died but had transformed himself into a spirit, that he would continue to protect the empire from beyond the grave. They spoke of signs and portents, of dreams and visions that confirmed his continuing presence among them. The succession crisis that followed was unlike anything the empire had ever faced. Sunni Ali had not clearly designated an heir, perhaps because he had never seriously contemplated his own mortality. His eldest son, Sunni Baru, claimed the throne by right of birth, but he was young, untested, and lacked his father's charisma and military genius. Many of the provincial governors and military commanders questioned whether he could hold the empire together. The challenge came from an unexpected source. Muhammad Tur, one of Sunni Ali's most trusted generals, had been campaigning in the eastern provinces when news of the king's death reached him. He was not of royal blood, not even of Songhai origin, but a Sonink from the ancient kingdom of Ghana. Yet he had served Sunni Ali faithfully for over a decade, had proven himself in battle after battle, had earned the respect of the army and the loyalty of the people. More importantly, he was a devout Muslim, a man who had made the pilgrimage to Mecca and had studied Islamic law with the scholars of Cairo. His faith was unquestioned, his orthodoxy beyond dispute. In an empire where religious tensions had always simmered beneath the surface, this was a powerful advantage. The civil war that followed was brief but decisive. Sunni Baru, despite his legitimate claim to the throne, found himself isolated and outmaneuvered. The army, which had been the foundation of his father's power, declared for Muhammad Tur. The provincial governors, recognizing the way the wind was blowing, switched their allegiance. Even the merchants and scholars, who might have been expected to support the continuity of the dynasty, threw their support behind the usurper. The final confrontation took place on the plains outside Gao, where Sunni Ali had won his first great victory decades earlier. But this time, the battle was not between Songhai and foreign invaders but between two claimants to the Songhai throne. The outcome was never really in doubt. Sunni Baru's forces, demoralized and outnumbered, melted away like morning mist. The young prince himself was captured and later executed, ending the direct line of Sunni Ali's descendants. Muhammad Tur entered Gao not as a conqueror but as a liberator. He proclaimed himself Askia, reviving an ancient title that had been used by the rulers of Gao before the rise of Mali. He promised to continue his predecessor's policies of expansion and integration while bringing the empire more closely into line with orthodox Islamic practice. The coronation ceremony was a masterpiece of political theater. It took place in the Great Mosque of Gao, before an audience that included representatives from every province of the empire. The new king wore simple white robes, eschewing the elaborate regalia that had marked Sunni Ali's court. He was invested not by traditional priests and diviners but by Islamic scholars and judges. The ceremony began with readings from the Quran and ended with prayers for the prosperity of the empire and the welfare of its people. But the true significance of the ceremony lay in what it represented. The empire that Sunni Ali had built through conquest and magic was being transformed into something new, something that could claim legitimacy not just through military might but through religious authority. The new Askia was not just a warrior king but a Muslim ruler, a man who could speak to the broader Islamic world as an equal. I watched these events unfold with the fascination of a scholar and the anxiety of a citizen. The empire I had served for most of my adult life was changing before my eyes. The old ways, the mixture of Islamic and traditional practices that had characterized Sunni Ali's rule, were being replaced by a more orthodox approach. The question was whether this transformation would strengthen the empire or weaken it. The answer began to emerge in the months that followed. Askia Muhammad, as he came to be known, proved to be a reformer of extraordinary energy and vision. He began by reorganizing the imperial administration, replacing many of Sunni Ali's appointees with men who shared his religious convictions and his administrative philosophy. He established new courts of Islamic law, created schools for the training of judges and administrators, and invited scholars from across the Muslim world to come to Gao. But his most dramatic gesture was the announcement of his intention to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. This was not just a personal act of devotion but a political statement of enormous significance. By undertaking the Hajj, he would demonstrate his orthodoxy to the Islamic world and establish diplomatic relations with the great powers of the Middle East. He would also follow in the footsteps of Mansa Musa, whose legendary pilgrimage had brought fame and recognition to the Mali Empire. The preparations for this journey took months. The Askia assembled a caravan of unprecedented size and magnificence. 500 horsemen would serve as his escort. 1,000 camels would carry supplies and gifts. The treasury was open to fund the expedition, and gold flowed like water to purchase the provisions and equipment needed for the journey across the Sahara. But this was not just a royal progress. The Askia used the pilgrimage as an opportunity to establish diplomatic relations with the rulers of North Africa and the Middle East. He sent ambassadors ahead to Cairo and Damascus, to Baghdad and Istanbul, announcing his coming and seeking audiences with the great Muslim rulers of the age. The pilgrimage itself was a triumph of organization and diplomacy. The Askia's caravan crossed the Sahara without serious incident, following the ancient routes that had carried trade and travelers for centuries. In Cairo, he was received by the Mamluk Sultan with all the honors due to a fellow Muslim ruler. In Mecca, he performed the required rituals with a piety that impressed even the most orthodox observers. But the real achievement of the pilgrimage was not religious but political. The Askia returned to Gao with more than just spiritual blessing. He brought with him scholars and administrators, craftsmen and soldiers, all of whom would help to transform the empire. He had established trade agreements with the great commercial centers of the Islamic world. He had gained recognition as a legitimate Muslim ruler, not just a local warlord who happened to control some territory in the Western Sudan. The impact of these changes was felt throughout the empire. The new administration was more efficient and more just than its predecessor. The expansion of Islamic education created a class of literate administrators who could manage the complex affairs of a vast empire. The diplomatic relations established during the pilgrimage opened new markets for the empire's goods and new sources of luxury imports. But perhaps the most significant change was in the nature of the empire itself. Under Sunni Ali, the empire had been held together by personal loyalty to a charismatic leader. Under Askia Muhammad, it was being transformed into an institutional state, one that could survive the death of any individual ruler. The new legal system, the expanded bureaucracy, the network of schools and scholars, all created bonds that went beyond personal allegiance. The military reforms that accompanied these administrative changes were equally significant. The Askia maintained the professional army that had been Sunni Ali's greatest innovation, but he reorganized it along more systematic lines. He created formal ranks and grades, established regular pay scales, and instituted training programs that standardized tactics and procedures across the entire force. More importantly, he expanded the army's role beyond mere conquest. The professional soldiers became agents of imperial integration, serving not just as warriors but as administrators, tax collectors, and judges. They were stationed in garrisons throughout the empire, where they served as visible symbols of imperial authority, while also carrying out the routine tasks of governance. The expansion of the empire continued under the new Askia, but it took on a different character. Where Sunni Ali had conquered through personal charisma and military genius, Askia Muhammad conquered through systematic organization and institutional strength. His armies were larger, better equipped, and more disciplined than those of his predecessor. His administrative apparatus was more sophisticated, his intelligence network more extensive, his diplomatic relations more far-reaching. The conquest of the Air region, with its valuable copper mines and its strategic position on the trans-Saharan trade routes, demonstrated the new empire's capabilities. The campaign was planned with meticulous care, supplied through a complex logistics network, and executed with a precision that would have been impossible under the old system. The resistance was overcome not through magic or personal heroism, but through the systematic application of overwhelming force. The integration of the conquered territory was equally systematic. New administrators were appointed, new legal codes were implemented, new schools were established. The local population was not simply subjugated but incorporated into the imperial system, with opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth or tribal affiliation. I witnessed these changes from my position in the imperial bureaucracy, where I had been promoted to serve as one of the Askia's personal secretaries. The transformation was remarkable to behold. The empire that had been built on the genius of one man was being converted into an institution that could function regardless of who occupied the throne. The new court was a very different place from the one I had known under Sunni Ali. Gone were the mysterious rituals and the consultation with traditional priests. In their place were formal ceremonies based on Islamic precedent, scholarly debates about legal and administrative issues, and diplomatic receptions for foreign ambassadors. The palace had become not just the residence of a king but the center of a bureaucratic state. Yet for all these changes, the essence of the empire remained the same. It was still a creation of the river, still dependent on the trade routes that converged at Gao, still drawing its strength from the diversity of peoples and cultures that had been brought together under imperial rule. The Askia had not destroyed what Sunni Ali had built. He had refined it, systematized it, given it a form that could endure. The river that flowed past the palace carried these changes with it, spreading the influence of the new empire far beyond its borders. The systematic administration, the expanded educational system, the diplomatic relations with foreign powers, all created a model of Islamic governance that would influence the development of African states for centuries to come. As I sat in my office late at night, copying documents and preparing reports, I often reflected on the magnitude of what I was witnessing. Two great rulers, as different as fire and water, had each contributed to the creation of something unprecedented in African history. Sunni Ali had provided the vision and the force to build an empire. Askia Muhammad had provided the wisdom and the organization to make it endure. The water moves slowly tonight, carrying with it the memory of this great transformation. The river remembers everything, and tonight, it remembers the moment when an empire of conquest became an empire of law, when personal rule gave way to institutional governance, when the kingdom of the river became a power that could speak as an equal to the great empires of the world. Part 6. The Reforms of Askia and the Pilgrimage to Mecca. The morning prayers had just ended when the Askia announced his greatest undertaking. I was in the palace courtyard, preparing the day's correspondence, when his voice echoed from the great hall. The words carried across the water like the call of a crane. He would make the pilgrimage to Mecca, following the path that Mansa Musa had taken 2 centuries before. The decision sent ripples of excitement and anxiety throughout the empire. A pilgrimage meant months of absence from the capital, months when the empire would be governed by regents and administrators. It meant enormous expense, as the Askia would need to travel with a retinue worthy of his station. Most importantly, it meant transformation, for no ruler returned from Mecca unchanged. I was 42 then, my beard showing the first threads of gray, my eyes strained from years of copying documents by lamplight. I had served in the imperial administration through the reigns of 2 great kings, had witnessed the birth and growth of an empire that now stretched from the Atlantic to the bend of the Niger. Yet I understood that I was about to witness something even more significant, the moment when our African empire would claim its place in the broader Islamic world. The preparations began immediately. The Askia summoned his council of ministers, his military commanders, his provincial governors. Plans were drawn up for the administration of the empire in his absence. Treasuries were opened, gold was counted and weighed, provisions were gathered. The pilgrimage would not be a simple journey of devotion but a diplomatic mission of the highest importance. The reforms that preceded the pilgrimage were as significant as the journey itself. The Askia understood that he could not leave the empire in the hands of a loose confederation of tribal chiefs and provincial strongmen. He needed to create institutional structures that could function without his direct supervision, bureaucratic systems that could maintain order and collect taxes whether he was present or not. The legal reforms came first. Under Sunni Ali, justice had been administered according to a mixture of Islamic law, traditional customs, and royal decree. Different regions followed different practices. Different peoples were judged by different standards. The system worked because the king's personal authority was absolute, because his will was law regardless of precedent or custom. But the Askia envisioned something more systematic. He appointed a council of Islamic scholars to codify the law, to create a unified legal system that could be applied consistently throughout the empire. The scholars worked for months, consulting the Quran and the Hadith, studying the legal traditions of other Islamic states, adapting universal principles to local conditions. The resulting legal code was a masterpiece of synthesis. It preserved the essential elements of Islamic law while accommodating the practical realities of governing a diverse African empire. Criminal law was standardized according to Islamic principles, but civil law allowed for regional variations. Commercial law was unified to facilitate trade, but family law respected local customs as long as they did not contradict Islamic teaching. The implementation of this legal system required a new class of professionals: judges, lawyers, and legal scholars who could interpret and apply the law consistently. The Askia established schools of jurisprudence in the major cities, bringing teachers from Cairo and Baghdad to train a generation of African legal experts. These men would become the backbone of the imperial administration, the human links that connected the capital to the most remote provinces. The administrative reforms were equally comprehensive. The Askia divided the empire into provinces, each governed by an appointed official who reported directly to the central government. These provincial governors were not hereditary rulers but career administrators, men who had proven their competence through service to the crown. They were moved regularly from one province to another, preventing them from developing local power bases that might threaten imperial authority. Below the provincial level, the Askia created a hierarchy of local administrators: district governors, town chiefs, village headmen. Each level of the hierarchy had clearly defined responsibilities and authority. Tax collection, military recruitment, law enforcement, and public works were all organized according to systematic procedures that could be followed regardless of who occupied which position. The military reforms were perhaps the most innovative of all. The Askia retained the professional army that had been Sunni Ali's greatest creation, but he reorganized it along more systematic lines. He created formal ranks and grades, established regular pay scales, and instituted training programs that standardized tactics and procedures across the entire force. More importantly, he expanded the army's role beyond mere conquest. The professional soldiers became agents of imperial integration, serving not just as warriors but as administrators, tax collectors, and judges. They were stationed in garrisons throughout the empire, where they served as visible symbols of imperial authority while also carrying out the routine tasks of governance. The economic reforms transformed the empire's fiscal system. Under Sunni Ali, taxation had been irregular and personal, based on tribute payments negotiated with individual rulers and communities. The Askia created a systematic tax structure based on land productivity, commercial activity, and population size. Tax assessments were calculated using standardized procedures, collected by trained officials, and recorded in detailed registers that were maintained at both the local and imperial levels. The revenue generated by this more efficient system was enormous. The imperial treasury, which had been depleted by decades of warfare, began to overflow with gold and silver. Trade duties from the trans-Saharan caravan routes provided a steady stream of income. Agricultural taxes from the fertile river valleys supported the growing bureaucracy. Mining revenues from the gold fields and copper deposits funded military expansion and public works. But the Askia did not simply hoard this wealth. He used it to transform the empire's infrastructure. New roads were built to connect the provincial capitals with the imperial center. Bridges were constructed across rivers and streams. Caravanserais were established along the major trade routes, providing security and accommodation for merchants and travelers. The postal system was expanded and improved, enabling rapid communication between the capital and the provinces. The educational reforms were perhaps the most far-reaching of all. The Askia understood that an empire based on Islamic law required a population educated in Islamic principles. He established schools in every major city, bringing teachers from the great centers of Islamic learning to staff them. The curriculum included not just religious instruction but also mathematics, astronomy, law, and administration. The University of Sankor in Timbuktu, which had declined during the years of Tuareg occupation, was restored and expanded. New faculties were created, new libraries were established, new scholars were recruited from across the Islamic world. The university became a center of learning that rivaled Cairo and Baghdad, attracting students from throughout Africa and beyond. The reforms extended even to the structure of the royal court. The Askia abolished many of the traditional ceremonies and rituals that had characterized Sunni Ali's reign, replacing them with practices based on Islamic precedent. The court became less mysterious, more accessible, more closely aligned with the practices of other Islamic rulers. The palace itself was rebuilt according to Islamic architectural principles. The new construction emphasized geometric patterns and calligraphic decoration rather than the more naturalistic styles that had prevailed under the previous regime. The Great Hall was redesigned to accommodate the formal ceremonies of Islamic kingship, with a throne that faced east toward Mecca and reception rooms that could house diplomatic delegations from throughout the Muslim world. By the time the reforms were complete, the empire had been transformed from a personal kingdom into an institutional state. The legal system, the administrative apparatus, the military organization, the fiscal structure, all had been systematized and professionalized. The empire could now function effectively whether the ruler was present or absent, whether he was a genius like Sunni Ali or a competent administrator like his successors. The pilgrimage itself was planned with the same systematic attention to detail that had characterized the domestic reforms. The Askia would travel with a retinue of 500 horsemen, 1,000 foot soldiers, and an uncounted number of servants, scholars, and officials. The caravan would include 100 camels carrying gold and gifts for distribution along the route, 50 camels loaded with provisions, and dozens of pack animals carrying the personal effects of the royal party. The diplomatic aspects of the journey were as important as the religious ones. The Askia sent ambassadors ahead to Cairo and Damascus, to Baghdad and Istanbul, announcing his coming and seeking audiences with the great Muslim rulers of the age. He carried letters of introduction from the scholars of Timbuktu, credentials that would establish his legitimacy as a Muslim ruler and open doors that might otherwise remain closed. The departure was a ceremony of unprecedented magnificence. The entire population of Gao turned out to see the royal caravan begin its journey. The Askia, dressed in simple white robes that emphasized his humility before God, mounted his horse and took his place at the head of the procession. Behind him rode his guards and officials, their armor gleaming in the morning sun, their banners streaming in the wind. The caravan moved slowly across the city, pausing at the great mosque for prayers and blessings. The imam offered a special prayer for the safety of the pilgrims and the prosperity of the empire in their absence. The congregation responded with a great Amen that echoed across the water. Then the procession resumed its stately progress, moving through the gates of the city and out into the desert beyond. I watched from the palace walls as the caravan disappeared into the northern horizon, a long line of men and animals rendered small by the vastness of the landscape. The dust cloud raised by their passage lingered in the air long after they had vanished from sight, a reminder of the great journey that had begun. The months that followed tested the reforms that the Askia had implemented. The empire was governed by a council of regents, men who had been chosen for their loyalty and competence. The provincial governors continued to administer their territories according to the procedures that had been established. The military commanders maintained order and security. The legal system continued to function, the tax collectors continued to collect, the schools continued to teach. And it worked. The empire that had been held together by the personal authority of its rulers proved capable of functioning as an institution. There were problems, certainly disputes and difficulties that required resolution. But the system was strong enough to handle them, flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, comprehensive enough to address the needs of a diverse population. The news of the pilgrimage reached us through the ancient networks of trade and communication. The Askia had crossed the Sahara without incident, his caravan protected by the treaties and agreements that regulated trans-desert commerce. In Cairo, he had been received by the Mamluk Sultan with all the honors due to a fellow Muslim ruler. The ceremony of welcome had been magnificent, with parades and banquets and formal audiences that lasted for days. The scholars of Al-Azhar University had examined the Askia's credentials and declared him to be a legitimate Muslim ruler, worthy of recognition and respect. This endorsement was crucial, for it established the Songhai Empire's place in the hierarchy of Islamic states. No longer would it be dismissed as a collection of pagan tribes led by a warrior magician. It was now recognized as a proper Islamic kingdom, governed according to Islamic law, led by a ruler who had proven his devotion through the ultimate act of faith. The pilgrimage to Mecca itself was accomplished with all the ceremony and devotion that tradition required. The Askia performed the ritual circumambulation of the Kaaba, joined the vast crowds of pilgrims in the prayers and ceremonies that marked the climax of the Hajj. He stood on the plain of Arafat with Muslims from every corner of the world, united in worship and devotion. But the religious significance of the pilgrimage was matched by its diplomatic importance. The Askia met with rulers and officials from throughout the Islamic world, establishing relationships that would benefit the empire for generations. He negotiated trade agreements, exchanged ambassadors, and created networks of communication that would connect the Songhai Empire to the broader Islamic community. The gifts he distributed along the route were legendary. Gold flowed from his treasury like water, supporting the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, funding schools and hospitals, endowing charitable foundations. The generosity was strategic as well as pious, for it established the Askia's reputation as a great Muslim ruler and demonstrated the wealth and power of his distant empire. The return journey was equally magnificent. The Askia traveled slowly, stopping at every major city to receive the homage of local rulers and the blessing of religious authorities. In Cairo, he was honored with a second reception even more elaborate than the first. In Tunis, he was received by the Hafsid Sultan as a brother and ally. In Fez, he was welcomed by the Marinid ruler as a fellow defender of the faith. The knowledge and experience he gained during the journey were as valuable as the diplomatic relationships he established. He observed the administrative practices of other Islamic states, studied their legal systems, learned from their scholars and officials. He recruited experts in various fields to return with him to the Songhai Empire, bringing new techniques and ideas that would further transform his kingdom. The return to Gao was a triumph that surpassed even the magnificent departure. The entire empire celebrated the successful completion of the pilgrimage. The Askia had proven his devotion to Islam, established his legitimacy as a Muslim ruler, and demonstrated the power and wealth of his kingdom to the world. The empire that had been built by conquest was now recognized as a legitimate member of the Islamic community. The changes that followed the pilgrimage were as significant as those that had preceded it. The scholars and experts who returned with the Askia brought new knowledge and techniques that transformed every aspect of imperial administration. The legal system was refined and expanded. The educational system was enhanced with new curricula and teaching methods. The military was reorganized according to the latest tactical principles. The diplomatic relationships established during the pilgrimage opened new markets for the empire's goods and new sources of luxury imports. Trade with North Africa expanded dramatically. Commercial relationships with the Middle East provided access to goods and ideas that had previously been unavailable. The empire's merchants found new opportunities in distant markets, while foreign traders brought new products and technologies to the cities of the Western Sudan. But perhaps the most important change was in the empire's self-perception. The Askia's pilgrimage had transformed the Songhai Empire from a regional power into a member of the international Islamic community. The empire's rulers could now negotiate with the Ottomans and the Mamluks as equals, could claim recognition from the caliph himself, could participate in the great debates and discussions that shaped the Islamic world. The water moves slowly tonight, carrying with it the memory of that great transformation. The river remembers everything, and tonight, it remembers the moment when an African empire claimed its place in the world, when the kingdom of the river became a power that could speak with the greatest rulers of the age, when the pilgrimage of one man elevated an entire civilization. Part 7. The Flourishing of Trade and Timbuktu. The years following the Askia's return from Mecca were like the flooding of the river after a long drought. Wealth flowed into the empire from every direction, transforming our cities into jewels that sparkled in the desert sun. I was 50 then, my hair white as the foam on the Niger's waters, my hands steady despite the decades of copying manuscripts and recording the endless transactions of empire. From my office in the palace, I could see the harbor of Gao filled with vessels from every corner of the known world. River barges heavy with gold from the mines of Bambuk. caravans from the salt deposits of Tagaza, their camels laden with the white crystals that were worth their weight in gold in the forest kingdoms to the south. Ships from the distant lands beyond the Great Bend, carrying ivory and slaves, exotic woods and rare spices. But it was not just the volume of trade that had changed. It was the sophistication of it, the complexity of the networks that now connected our empire to markets from Morocco to Egypt, from the Atlantic coast to the Indian Ocean. The Askia's pilgrimage had opened doors that had been closed for generations, had established relationships that transformed the Songhai Empire from a regional power into a hub of international commerce. The transformation was most visible in Timbuktu, that ancient city of scholars and merchants that had become the intellectual heart of our empire. When I first visited it as a young man, during the chaotic years after Mali's collapse, it had been a shadow of its former self. The great library of Sankor had been scattered, its scholars fled, its manuscripts hidden or destroyed. The market that had once attracted merchants from across the Sahara had become a battleground for competing warlords. Now, as I made my regular journey to the city to inspect the imperial records and oversee the collection of taxes, I marveled at the change. The streets that had once echoed with the clash of weapons now hummed with the sounds of commerce and learning. The air that had once been filled with the smoke of burning buildings now carried the scent of spices and perfumes from distant lands. The great mosque of Timbuktu stood restored to its former glory, its mud-brick walls rising like golden cliffs from the sandy streets. The morning prayers echoed across the city with a clarity that spoke of confidence and prosperity. The afternoon call to prayer was answered by thousands of voices, creating a sound that seemed to merge with the whisper of wind through the acacia trees. But it was the University of Sankor that truly demonstrated the city's renaissance. The Askia had spared no expense in its restoration, bringing scholars from Cairo and Baghdad, from Cordoba and Fez. The library had been rebuilt and restocked with manuscripts from every corner of the Islamic world. The lecture halls echoed with debates on theology and law, mathematics and astronomy, history and literature. I remember attending a lecture by Ahmad Baba, perhaps the greatest scholar of our age. He spoke about the relationship between faith and reason, his words flowing like water over stones, smooth and clear and compelling. The audience included students from across Africa and beyond, young men from the forests of Guinea, scholars from the kingdoms of Hausa, merchants' sons from the cities of the Maghreb. The knowledge that flowed through these halls was as valuable as the gold that flowed through our markets. Manuscripts were copied and traded like precious commodities. New ideas were discussed and debated with the intensity of merchants negotiating the price of salt. The city had become a center of learning that rivaled the great universities of the East, a place where the wisdom of the ancient world was preserved and transmitted to future generations. The market of Timbuktu was a wonder to behold. The great square in the center of the city was filled from dawn to dusk with merchants and customers, their voices creating a symphony of commerce that could be heard from miles away. The variety of goods was staggering. Salt from the mines of Tagaza, gold from the fields of Bambuk, copper from the mountains of Air, ivory from the forests of the south. But these were just the foundation of a trade network that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of the trans-Saharan commerce. Spices from India arrived via the ports of the Red Sea and the overland routes through Egypt. Silk from China came through the ancient networks that connected the Middle East to the Far East. Precious stones from distant lands sparkled in the shops of the jewelers' quarter. The merchants who conducted this trade were a cosmopolitan group that reflected the international character of the empire. Arabs from the northern cities, their caravans protected by treaties negotiated during the Askia's pilgrimage. Berbers from the desert, their knowledge of the hidden oases and secret routes invaluable to the caravan trade. Hausa traders from the east, their pack animals laden with leather goods and textiles. Wang-era gold merchants from the forests, their identities carefully concealed but their wealth undeniable. The organization of this trade was as sophisticated as its scope. The empire had established a system of commercial law that protected merchants and facilitated transactions. Standard weights and measures were enforced throughout the territory. Credit systems allowed traders to conduct business across vast distances without carrying enormous quantities of gold and silver. Insurance arrangements protected against the risks of desert travel and river transport. The caravanserais that served this trade were marvels of engineering and organization. The great complex at Walata, positioned at the southern edge of the Sahara, could accommodate thousands of camels and their drivers. The facility included stables and storage areas, workshops and trading halls, mosques and schools. It was a city within a city, a place where the desert met the savanna and the cultures of North and West Africa merged and mingled. The profits from this trade transformed every aspect of life in the empire. The royal treasury overflowed with gold and silver, enabling the Askia to fund ambitious construction projects and military campaigns. The merchant classes grew wealthy and influential, building elaborate houses and patronizing artists and scholars. Even ordinary citizens benefited from the prosperity, as increased trade created employment and raised living standards throughout the empire. The construction projects undertaken with this wealth were monuments to the empire's power and sophistication. The Great Mosque of Gao was rebuilt in a style that combined traditional African architecture with Islamic design principles. The palace complex was expanded and modernized, with new reception halls that could accommodate diplomatic delegations from the greatest powers of the world. But perhaps the most impressive projects were the public works that served the entire population. New roads connected the major cities, facilitating trade and communication. Bridges spanning rivers and streams made travel safer and faster. Irrigation systems brought water to previously barren lands, expanding agricultural production and supporting population growth. The postal system established by the Askia was a marvel of efficiency that enabled rapid communication across the vast empire. Relay stations positioned at regular intervals along the major routes maintained supplies of horses and provisions for official messengers. The system was so reliable that a message could travel from Timbuktu to Gao in less than a week, a journey that had previously taken months. The cultural flowering that accompanied this economic prosperity was equally remarkable. The empire became a center of artistic and intellectual achievement that attracted talent from across the Islamic world. Poets and musicians, architects and craftsmen, all found patronage and opportunity in the cities of the Songhai Empire. The architectural style that emerged during this period was distinctly African while incorporating influences from across the Islamic world. The mosques and palaces built during the Askia's reign featured the traditional mud brick construction of the region but enhanced with decorative elements borrowed from North African and Middle Eastern traditions. The result was a unique synthesis that reflected the cosmopolitan character of the empire. The textile industry of the empire reached new heights of sophistication and artistry. The workshops of Timbuktu and Gao produced fabrics that were prized throughout the Islamic world for their quality and beauty. The dyers of Kano created colors that were more vibrant than any produced elsewhere. The weavers of Djenne developed techniques that enabled them to create patterns of unprecedented complexity and elegance. The leather goods produced in the empire were equally renowned. The tanners of Kano and Katsina had perfected techniques that produced leather of extraordinary softness and durability. The skilled craftsmen who worked this leather created products that were sought after from Morocco to Egypt. Shoes and sandals, bags and pouches, book covers and decorative items. The metalworking industry flourished as well, supported by the empire's control of important mining regions. The smiths of Air produced copper goods that were traded throughout West Africa. The goldsmiths of Timbuktu created jewelry and decorative objects that demonstrated the highest levels of technical skill and artistic achievement. The ironworkers of the forest regions produced tools and weapons that were superior to anything available elsewhere. The agricultural prosperity that supported this urban flowering was based on the empire's sophisticated understanding of irrigation and land management. The flood plains of the Niger were carefully managed to maximize agricultural productivity. Complex systems of canals and dikes controlled the annual flooding, ensuring that the maximum amount of fertile silt was deposited on the fields while preventing destructive floods. The crops grown in these fields fed not just the local population but the entire empire. Rice from the river valleys, millet from the savanna, sorghum from the drier regions, all contributed to a food supply that was both abundant and reliable. The surplus production supported the growth of urban centers and freed large numbers of people to engage in trade, crafts, and scholarly pursuits. The empire's control of the salt trade was particularly significant. The deposits at Tagaza, located deep in the Sahara, produced salt that was essential for preserving food and maintaining health in the hot climate of tropical Africa. The empire's monopoly on this trade generated enormous revenues while creating dependencies that helped maintain political control over distant regions. The gold trade remained the foundation of the empire's wealth, but it was now organized on a much more sophisticated level than ever before. The empire maintained careful control over the mining regions, ensuring that production was steady and that revenues flowed to the imperial treasury. The gold was traded not just as raw material but as finished products, jewelry, decorative objects, and coins that carried the empire's name and reputation throughout the Islamic world. The slave trade, unfortunately, was also a significant component of the empire's economy. Prisoners of war, criminals, and people captured in raids were sold in the markets of Timbuktu and Gao, then transported across the Sahara to the slave markets of North Africa and the Middle East. This trade, while profitable, was also a source of moral tension within the empire, as Islamic law provided protections for slaves that were not always observed in practice. The diplomatic relations established during the Askia's pilgrimage continued to pay dividends throughout this period. The empire maintained embassies in Cairo and Baghdad, in Tunis and Fez. These diplomatic missions not only protected the empire's commercial interests but also facilitated the exchange of ideas and technologies that contributed to the empire's continued development. The military strength that protected this prosperity was maintained at the highest levels. The professional army created by Sunni Ali and refined by Askia Muhammad was now a force that could compete with any military in the world. The soldiers were well-trained, well-equipped, and well-paid. Their loyalty to the empire was absolute, their effectiveness in battle proven in countless campaigns. The river that had given birth to this empire continued to be its lifeline, carrying goods and people, ideas and innovations from one end of the territory to the other. The great ports of Gao and Timbuktu were connected by a network of smaller harbors and trading posts that facilitated commerce and communication. The river was not just a highway but a unifying force that bound the diverse regions of the empire together. As I grew older and my responsibilities increased, I had the opportunity to travel throughout the empire, observing the changes that prosperity had brought. Every city showed signs of growth and development. New buildings rose from the ancient foundations. Markets expanded to accommodate increased trade. Schools and mosques multiplied to serve growing populations. The diversity of the empire was its greatest strength. The fusion of different cultures, traditions, and peoples created a civilization that was uniquely African while being fully integrated into the broader Islamic world. The empire was a bridge between the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan Africa, between the ancient traditions of the continent and the newer influences of Islam. But even as I marveled at the prosperity and achievement of these golden years, I could not shake the feeling that they were too good to last. The river had taught me that all things flow, that what rises must eventually fall, that the wheel of fortune turns for empires as it does for individuals. The very success of the empire might be creating the conditions for its eventual decline. The water moves slowly tonight, carrying with it the memory of those golden years when our empire stood at the height of its power and influence. The river remembers everything, and tonight it remembers the time when Timbuktu was the Paris of Africa, when our merchants were princes, when our scholars were the equals of any in the world, when the name of Songhai was spoken with respect from Morocco to Mecca. Part 8: The Golden Age of the Empire. The sun set differently during those years, painting the sky in shades of gold that seemed to mirror the wealth flowing through our streets. I was approaching my 60th year, my body bent with age but my mind sharp as ever, when I witnessed the true flowering of the Songhai Empire. These were the years when every dream seemed possible, when every ambition could be fulfilled, when the future stretched before us like an endless river of opportunity. The palace of Gao had become a wonder of the world. Diplomats from distant lands walked its corridors, their eyes wide with amazement at the wealth and sophistication they encountered. The throne room, rebuilt after the Askia's return from Mecca, could accommodate 1,000 courtiers. Its walls were decorated with geometric patterns inlaid with gold, its ceiling painted with verses from the Quran in calligraphy that would have been admired in Baghdad or Cairo. I remember the morning when the ambassador from the Ottoman Sultan arrived. He had traveled for months across the desert, his caravan protected by treaties and agreements that spoke to the empire's international standing. His audience with the Askia was a ceremony of unprecedented magnificence, a display of power and culture that left no doubt about the empire's place in the world. The ambassador presented gifts from the Sultan, silk fabrics from Constantinople, jeweled daggers from Damascus, rare books from the libraries of Istanbul. But the gifts offered in return were even more impressive. Gold vessels crafted by the finest artisans of Timbuktu, leather goods dyed in colors that could not be found anywhere else, manuscripts copied by scribes whose skill was legendary throughout the Islamic world. The conversation between the two men was conducted in Arabic, the lingua franca of the Islamic world. But I could see in the ambassador's eyes the respect and admiration that the Askia commanded. This was not a meeting between a great power and a provincial kingdom, but between equals, between rulers who spoke the same language of diplomacy and understood the same principles of statecraft. The cultural achievements of this period were as remarkable as the diplomatic and commercial ones. The empire had become a center of learning that attracted scholars from across the known world. The libraries of Timbuktu held manuscripts in dozens of languages, covering every field of human knowledge. The scholars who worked in these libraries were engaged in cutting-edge research in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. I had the privilege of working closely with many of these scholars, copying their manuscripts, organizing their research, facilitating their correspondence with colleagues in distant lands. The intellectual ferment was extraordinary. New ideas were being developed, ancient wisdom was being reinterpreted, the boundaries of human knowledge were being pushed ever further. The mathematician Al-Qasim ibn Yusuf, who had come to Timbuktu from Cairo, was working on problems of algebra and geometry that would not be solved in Europe for centuries. His calculations were precise, his proofs elegant, his insights profound. The manuscripts he produced were copied and sent to scholars throughout the Islamic world, spreading the reputation of Songhai scholarship far beyond the borders of the empire. The astronomer Muhammad ibn Ahmad was mapping the movement of the stars with an accuracy that surpassed anything produced elsewhere. His observations were made from a purpose-built observatory on the outskirts of Timbuktu, using instruments that had been crafted by the finest metalworkers of the empire. His star charts were sought after by navigators from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. The historian Ahmad Baba was compiling a comprehensive chronicle of the empire's rise and development. His work was based on careful research in the imperial archives, interviews with eyewitnesses, and analysis of documents from throughout the region. The resulting history was a masterpiece of scholarship that preserved the memory of our great achievements for future generations. But it was not just the foreign scholars who contributed to this intellectual flowering. The empire had produced its own generation of learned men, Africans who had been educated in the schools of Timbuktu and Gao, who combined traditional wisdom with Islamic learning, who brought unique perspectives to the great questions of their age. The legal scholar Mahmud ibn Umar al-Akit was developing a synthesis of Islamic law and African customary practice that would influence legal thinking throughout the region. His commentaries on the Quran and the Hadith were studied in law schools from Morocco to Egypt. His fatwas on complex legal questions were sought by judges and administrators throughout the Islamic world. The poet Abd al-Rahman ibn Abdullah was creating works of literature that captured the unique character of African Islamic culture. His verses celebrated the beauty of the desert, the majesty of the river, the courage of the warriors who had built the empire. His poetry was recited in the courts of kings and in the tents of nomads, uniting the diverse peoples of the empire in a shared cultural identity. The physician Ali ibn al-Hassan was advancing the practice of medicine through careful observation and experimentation. His hospital in Timbuktu was a center of medical learning that attracted patients and students from across Africa. His treatises on tropical diseases were groundbreaking works that saved countless lives and advanced the understanding of health and healing in hot climates. The artistic achievements of this period were equally impressive. The empire had developed distinctive styles in architecture, sculpture, and decorative arts that reflected its unique cultural synthesis. The mosques and palaces built during these years were marvels of engineering and design, combining traditional African forms with Islamic aesthetics to create something entirely new. The Great Mosque of Timbuktu, rebuilt during the Askia's reign, was a masterpiece of mud brick architecture. Its walls rose like golden cliffs from the sandy streets, their surfaces decorated with geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change in the desert light. The minaret, visible from miles away, was a beacon that guided travelers across the trackless wastes of the Sahara. The royal palace of Gao was even more impressive. Its courtyards were filled with fountains and gardens, its halls decorated with intricate tilework and carved wood. The throne room was a space of overwhelming grandeur, designed to impress visiting dignitaries with the power and sophistication of the empire. The private quarters were more intimate but no less beautiful, with rooms that opened onto terraces overlooking the river. The craftsmanship that went into these buildings was extraordinary. The masons who built the walls were masters of their art, able to create structures that were both beautiful and functional. The carpenters who crafted the doors and windows were skilled in techniques that had been passed down through generations. The decorative artists who created the patterns and designs were inspired by traditions that spanned the Islamic world. The textile industry of the empire reached new heights during these years. The workshops of Timbuktu and Gao produced fabrics that were prized throughout the known world. The cotton grown in the river valleys was spun into thread of exceptional quality. The dyes used to color the cloth were made from plants and minerals found throughout the empire, creating colors that were more vibrant and lasting than anything produced elsewhere. The weavers who created these fabrics were artists as well as craftsmen. Their patterns were inspired by Islamic geometric traditions but adapted to African tastes and preferences. The resulting textiles were uniquely beautiful, combining the mathematical precision of Islamic design with the organic rhythms of African art. The leather goods produced in the empire were equally renowned. The tanners of Kano and Katsina had perfected techniques that produced leather of extraordinary quality. The hides were processed using methods that had been refined over generations, resulting in leather that was soft, durable, and beautiful. The craftsmen who worked this leather created products that were sought after from Morocco to Egypt: shoes and sandals, bags and pouches, book covers and decorative items. The metalworking industry of the empire was perhaps the most advanced in the world. The smiths of Air produced copper goods that were traded throughout West Africa. The goldsmiths of Timbuktu created jewelry and decorative objects that demonstrated the highest levels of technical skill and artistic achievement. The ironworkers of the forest regions produced tools and weapons that were superior to anything available elsewhere. The agricultural prosperity that supported this urban flowering was based on centuries of experience in managing the challenging environment of the Western Sudan. The farmers of the river valleys had learned to work with the annual flood cycle, timing their planting and harvesting to take advantage of the fertile silt deposited by the rising waters. The irrigation systems they had developed were marvels of engineering that enabled them to cultivate crops even in the dry season. The variety of crops grown in the empire was remarkable. Rice flourished in the flooded fields of the river valleys. Millet and sorghum grew in the drier regions, providing grain that could be stored for long periods. Vegetables and fruits were cultivated in the irrigated gardens near the cities. Cotton was grown for the textile industry, while other crops provided raw materials for various crafts and industries. The livestock industry was equally important. The cattle herds of the Fulani provided meat and milk, leather and horn. The sheep and goats of the desert regions were adapted to the harsh conditions, providing food and fiber for the nomadic peoples. The horses bred for the army and the aristocracy were among the finest in the world, combining speed and endurance with intelligence and courage. The trade networks that connected the empire to the rest of the world had reached unprecedented levels of sophistication. The great caravan routes across the Sahara were protected by treaties and agreements that ensured safe passage for merchants and their goods. The river routes that connected the various regions of the empire were well maintained and efficiently administered. The coastal trade that linked the empire to the Atlantic world was growing in importance. The goods that flowed through these networks were incredibly diverse. Salt from the mines of Tagaza was traded for gold from the fields of Bambuk. Copper from the mountains of Air was exchanged for ivory from the forests of the south. Textiles from the workshops of Timbuktu were bartered for spices from distant lands. The volume of trade was enormous, generating wealth that supported the entire structure of the empire. The banking and credit systems that facilitated this trade were as sophisticated as any in the world. Merchants could conduct business across vast distances without carrying large quantities of gold and silver. Letters of credit were honored in markets from Morocco to Egypt. Insurance arrangements protected against the risks of desert travel and river transport. The financial networks that supported this trade were managed by skilled professionals who understood the complexities of international commerce. The legal framework that governed this commercial activity was equally sophisticated. The empire had developed a comprehensive system of commercial law that protected merchants and facilitated transactions. Standard weights and measures were enforced throughout the territory. Disputes were resolved by skilled judges who understood both Islamic law and local customs. The result was a business environment that encouraged investment and innovation. The military strength that protected this prosperity was maintained at the highest levels. The professional army created by Sunni Ali and refined by Askia Muhammad was now a force that could compete with any military in the world. The soldiers were well-trained, well-equipped, and well-paid. Their loyalty to the empire was absolute, their effectiveness in battle proven in countless campaigns. The organization of the army was a model of efficiency. The various units were specialized for different types of warfare: heavy cavalry for shock action, light cavalry for reconnaissance and pursuit, infantry for siege warfare and garrison duty, archers for long-range combat. The coordination between these different units was seamless, the result of years of training and experience. The weapons and equipment used by the army were the finest that the empire's craftsmen could produce. The swords were forged from the best steel. The armor was crafted from the finest leather and metal. The bows were made from the most resilient woods. The horses were bred for warfare, combining speed and endurance with intelligence and courage. The fortifications that protected the empire's cities were equally impressive. The walls of Gao and Timbuktu were massive structures that could withstand the most determined assault. The gates were protected by complex defensive systems that made them almost impregnable. The towers and battlements were positioned to provide maximum coverage of the surrounding terrain. But it was not just the military strength of the empire that protected its prosperity. The diplomatic relationships established during the Askia's pilgrimage continued to provide security and stability. The empire maintained embassies in all the major capitals of the Islamic world. These diplomatic missions not only protected the empire's commercial interests, but also provided early warning of potential threats. The intelligence networks that supported this diplomacy were comprehensive and efficient. The empire maintained agents in all the major trading centers, men who reported on political developments, economic conditions, and military activities. This information was analyzed by skilled professionals who could identify potential threats and opportunities. The result was a foreign policy that was both proactive and responsive. The internal administration of the empire was equally sophisticated. The provincial governors who managed the various regions were skilled administrators who understood both the needs of their local populations and the requirements of the central government. The tax collectors who generated the empire's revenue were honest and efficient, ensuring that the burden of taxation was fairly distributed and that the maximum amount of revenue reached the imperial treasury. The communication systems that connected the various parts of the empire were marvels of organization. The postal service could deliver messages across vast distances in a matter of days. The road network that connected the major cities was well-maintained and efficiently administered. The river transport system that moved goods and people along the Niger was managed by skilled professionals who understood the complexities of navigation and logistics. As I reflect on those golden years, I am struck by the remarkable achievement they represented. The empire had become more than just a political entity. It had become a civilization. The synthesis of African and Islamic cultures had created something entirely new, something that was uniquely suited to the conditions of the Western Sudan, while being fully integrated into the broader Islamic world. The prosperity of those years was not just material but intellectual and spiritual as well. The empire had become a center of learning that attracted scholars from across the known world. The libraries of Timbuktu held manuscripts in dozens of languages, covering every field of human knowledge. The universities and schools had produced a generation of educated Africans who could compete with scholars from any part of the Islamic world. The religious life of the empire was equally flourishing. The mosques were filled with worshippers, the schools were full of students, the scholars were engaged in cutting-edge research on theological questions. The synthesis of Islamic and African traditions had created a form of religious practice that was both orthodox and uniquely African. But even as I celebrated these achievements, I could not shake the feeling that they were too good to last. The river had taught me that all things flow, that what rises must eventually fall, that the wheel of fortune turns for empires as it does for individuals. The very success of the empire might be creating the conditions for its eventual decline. The water moves slowly tonight, carrying with it the memory of those golden years when our empire stood at the height of its power and achievement. The river remembers everything, and tonight, it remembers the time when Songhai was the jewel of Africa, when our cities were the envy of the world, when our name was spoken with respect from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, when the future seemed as bright and endless as the desert sun. Part 9. The first signs of danger from the north. The first shadow fell across our golden age on a morning when the harmattan winds carried more than sand. I was 65 then, my hands trembling as I wrote but my memory clear as the river after the flood. The message arrived with a merchant caravan from Fez, written in Arabic script that seemed to shake with urgency even as it lay still upon the parchment. The Sultan of Morocco was asking questions. Not the polite inquiries of diplomatic correspondence, but the careful probings of a hunter studying his prey. He wanted to know about our military strength, our trade routes, our sources of wealth. His ambassadors, who had once come to our court with gifts and respectful greetings, now arrived with maps and measuring instruments, their eyes taking note of everything they saw. At first, the Askia dismissed these concerns as the paranoia of old men who had seen too many empires rise and fall. Morocco was far away, separated from us by the vast expanse of the Sahara. The Saadi dynasty that ruled there had their own problems to worry about. The Portuguese along their coast, the Ottomans pressing from the east, the perpetual rebellions that plagued all North African kingdoms. But I had learned to read the signs that others ignored. The wind patterns of politics were shifting, just as the harmattan brought change to the weather. The delicate balance of power that had protected our empire for generations was beginning to tilt in ways that would prove dangerous. The root of the problem lay in our very success. The wealth that flowed through our cities, the gold that made our merchants princes, the prosperity that supported our scholars and artists. All of this had attracted attention from those who possessed less but coveted more. The trans-Saharan trade routes that had enriched us for centuries were becoming the focus of others' ambitions. Morocco had always been a participant in this trade, but as a middleman rather than a controller. The caravans that carried our gold to the Mediterranean ports, the merchants who exchanged our goods for European luxuries, the networks that connected our empire to the wider world, all passed through Moroccan territory. The Saadi sultans collected taxes and duties, but they did not control the source of the wealth. That was changing. The Portuguese had established trading posts along the Atlantic coast, offering alternative routes for African goods to reach European markets. The Ottomans controlled the eastern Mediterranean, threatening traditional trade routes through Egypt and Syria. Morocco found itself squeezed between these great powers, its traditional role as a trade intermediary under threat. The solution, from the Moroccan perspective, was obvious. If they could not control the northern outlets of the trans-Saharan trade, they would control the southern sources. The gold mines of Bambuk, the salt deposits of Tagaza, the commercial networks of the Western Sudan, all would become Moroccan possessions. The wealth that had made Songhai great would flow north to Marrakesh and Fez instead of east to Gao and Timbuktu. The signs of this ambition had been visible for years to those who knew how to read them. Moroccan merchants had been arriving in increasing numbers, not just to trade but to establish permanent settlements. They brought with them detailed knowledge of our cities, our defenses, our strengths and weaknesses. They mapped our river systems, studied our agricultural methods, assessed our military capabilities. The salt mines of Tagaza, which lay deep in the desert between our territory and theirs, became a particular focus of attention. These mines had been under Songhai control for generations, worked by our slaves and administered by our officials. The salt they produced was essential to our economy, traded throughout West Africa for gold and other valuable goods. But the mines were difficult to defend, isolated in the desert and dependent on long supply lines from the south. A determined enemy could cut these supply lines, capture the mines, and deny us one of our most important sources of revenue. The Moroccans understood this vulnerability and began to probe our defenses in the region. The first incidents were minor, dismissed as the actions of bandits or rogue tribal leaders. Caravans were attacked, guard posts were raided, workers at the mines reported strange men watching them from the dunes. But the pattern was clear to those who looked carefully. These were not random acts of violence but systematic reconnaissance, the preparation for something larger. The Askia, now an old man whose legendary energy was beginning to fade, struggled to respond to these new challenges. The military that had served him so well in the conquest of neighboring kingdoms was designed for fighting traditional enemies. African cavalry, infantry armed with spears and shields, fortified cities that could be taken by siege. The threat from Morocco was different, more sophisticated, more dangerous. The Moroccans had access to new technologies that were beginning to transform warfare throughout the world. Portuguese traders had brought them firearms, weapons that could kill at distances that made traditional armor useless. Spanish mercenaries had taught them new tactics, ways of fighting that had been developed in the wars of Europe. Ottoman advisors had shown them how to manufacture gunpowder, how to cast cannon, how to conduct modern siege warfare. Our own military, for all its skill and courage, was still largely medieval in its equipment and tactics. We had some firearms, acquired through trade or captured in battle, but not enough to equip our entire army. Our soldiers were trained in traditional methods of warfare, effective against traditional enemies but potentially inadequate against modern military technology. The intelligence reports that reached the capital painted a disturbing picture. The Moroccan army was being modernized and expanded. New regiments were being formed, equipped with firearms and trained in their use. Artillery was being manufactured in workshops that employed European specialists. The military preparations were on a scale that could only be intended for a major campaign. The diplomatic situation was equally alarming. Morocco was actively seeking allies for its planned invasion, negotiating with Ottoman officials, corresponding with European powers, trying to build a coalition that would support its expansion into the Western Sudan. The letters intercepted by our agents spoke of Morocco as the rightful heir to the trans-Saharan trade, the natural leader of Islamic Africa. The religious dimension of the threat was particularly troubling. The Moroccans presented their planned invasion not as a conquest but as a holy war, a jihad against rulers who had corrupted Islam with pagan practices. They pointed to the syncretic religious traditions of our empire, the way Islamic and African beliefs had been blended together, as evidence of our unfitness to rule. This religious propaganda was effective among some segments of the population. The Orthodox Muslims of our cities, who had never fully accepted the religious compromises of the Askia's rule, began to question whether resistance to Morocco was justified. If the Moroccans were truly fighting to purify Islam, some argued, should good Muslims not support them rather than oppose them? The economic pressures were mounting as well. The preparation for war required enormous expenditures, draining the imperial treasury that had been built up over decades of prosperity. The military had to be expanded and re-equipped, fortifications had to be strengthened, supplies had to be stockpiled. The burden of these preparations fell heavily on the population, creating resentment and unrest. The trade that had been the foundation of our prosperity was also under threat. Merchants were reluctant to risk their goods on journeys that might be interrupted by war. The caravans that had once crossed the Sahara in regular processions became fewer and smaller. The markets of Timbuktu and Djenne, once bustling with activity, began to show signs of decline. The psychological impact of these changes was perhaps the most serious of all. The confidence that had characterized our empire during its golden age was beginning to erode. The sense of invincibility that had sustained us through decades of expansion and prosperity was being replaced by uncertainty and fear. The future that had once seemed bright and limitless now appeared clouded with danger. I watched these changes with the growing sense of a man who sees storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The empire that had seemed so strong, so stable, so permanent, was revealing itself to be more fragile than anyone had imagined. The threats that had seemed distant and manageable were growing closer and more dangerous with each passing day. The younger generation, those who had grown up during the Golden Age, struggled to understand the magnitude of the challenge we faced. They had known only prosperity and success, victory and expansion. The idea that their empire might be vulnerable, that their way of life might be threatened, was almost incomprehensible to them. But those of us who had lived through the chaos that preceded the rise of Songhai, who remembered the dark years of invasion and occupation, recognized the signs. The wheel of history was turning again, and we were about to enter a period of trial that would test everything we had built. The preparations for defense began slowly, hampered by the very prosperity that had made us a target. The cities that had grown rich on trade were reluctant to spend their wealth on fortifications. The merchants who had profited from peace were hesitant to support military preparations that might disrupt their business. The scholars who had flourished in our libraries were reluctant to believe that their world of learning might be destroyed by war. The Askia, despite his age and declining health, threw himself into the preparations with characteristic energy. He summoned his military commanders, consulted with his advisors, toured the frontier regions to assess our defenses. But even his legendary leadership could not disguise the fundamental problem. We were preparing to fight a modern war with medieval weapons, to defend against European technology with traditional tactics. The fortress of Timbuktu, that great center of learning and commerce, began to show signs of martial preparation. The walls were strengthened, the gates were reinforced, the towers were equipped with what artillery we possessed. But the preparations could not hide the fact that the city was designed for trade, not for war. Its open layout, its commercial districts, its libraries and schools, all made it vulnerable to the kind of assault that modern warfare could deliver. The army that had once seemed invincible was revealed to have serious weaknesses. The cavalry that had dominated the battlefields of West Africa would be helpless against artillery and firearms. The infantry that had conquered kingdoms would be vulnerable to enemies who could kill from distances that made traditional weapons useless. The fortifications that had protected our cities for centuries would crumble before modern siege techniques. The intelligence reports from the north grew more alarming with each passing month. The Moroccan preparations were nearly complete. The army was assembled, the supplies were gathered, the diplomatic arrangements were in place. The invasion that had been talked about for years was about to become reality. The last diplomatic missions sent to Morocco returned with grim news. The Sultan was determined to proceed with his plans. The economic arguments, the religious appeals, the offers of increased tribute, all had been rejected. The die was cast, the decision was made. War was inevitable. The final months of preparation were marked by a strange combination of frantic activity and fatalistic acceptance. Everyone understood what was coming, but no one was sure we could prevent it. The empire that had seemed so powerful, so enduring, so blessed by God and history, was about to face its greatest trial. The young men who had grown up in peace began to train for war. The scholars who had spent their lives in libraries began to study military treatises. The merchants who had known only prosperity began to hide their wealth. The entire empire began to prepare for a struggle that would determine whether the civilization we had built would survive or perish. The river continued to flow, as it always had, carrying with it the hopes and fears of a people who had built their lives beside its waters. But now the water seemed to whisper warnings, to carry omens of the storm that was approaching from the north. The Golden Age was ending, and the time of trial was about to begin. The water moved slowly tonight, carrying with it the memory of those dark months when we first understood the magnitude of the threat we faced. The river remembers everything, and tonight, it remembers the moment when the shadows began to lengthen across our empire, when the clouds gathered on the northern horizon, when the peace that had blessed us for generations began to crack like drought-stricken earth under the weight of approaching war. Part 10. The Final Days and the Foreboding of the Battle of Tondabai. The last days of our golden age passed like the final moments of sunset, each one more precious because we knew the darkness was coming. I was 71 when the Moroccan army crossed the Atlas Mountains and began its march toward our lands. My hands shook as I wrote the final entries in the Imperial Chronicles, recording the end of an era that had seemed eternal just a few years before. The news came to us in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror that reflected a truth too terrible to see whole. The Moroccan force was enormous, larger than any army that had ever crossed the Sahara. They had camels for the desert crossing, horses for the cavalry charges, and something we had never seen before: thousands of men armed with firearms, weapons that could kill at distances that made our traditional armor useless. Their leader was Ahmad al-Mansur, a ruler who had earned his title, the Victorious, through decades of warfare against the Portuguese and the Ottomans. He was not a desert raider or a tribal chieftain, but a modern monarch who understood the new methods of warfare that were transforming the world. His army was equipped with European weapons, trained by European instructors, and organized according to European military principles. The contrast with our own forces was stark and troubling. Our army was still largely medieval in its equipment and tactics. We had spears and swords, bows and arrows, the traditional weapons that had served us well for centuries. We had some firearms, acquired through trade or captured in battle, but not enough to equip more than a small fraction of our soldiers. Our cavalry was magnificent, our infantry was brave, our commanders were experienced, but we were preparing to fight a modern war with ancient weapons. The Askia, despite his advanced age and failing health, threw himself into the preparations with the energy of a man half his age. He summoned his provincial governors, called up the military reserves, and began the massive task of organizing the empire's defense. But even his legendary leadership could not disguise the fundamental problem we faced. We were about to confront an enemy who possessed technological advantages that might prove decisive. The intelligence reports that reached the capital painted an increasingly grim picture. The Moroccan army was not just large but well-supplied and well-organized. They had established supply bases across the desert, negotiated safe passage with the Tuareg tribes, and recruited local guides who knew the terrain. This was not a desperate gamble but a carefully planned campaign that had been in preparation for years. The religious dimension of the invasion was particularly troubling. The Moroccans presented their campaign not as a conquest but as a holy war, a jihad against rulers who had corrupted Islam with pagan practices. They pointed to the syncretic religious traditions of our empire, the way Islamic and African beliefs had been blended together, as evidence of our unfitness to rule. This religious propaganda was effective among some segments of the population, creating divisions within our own ranks at the worst possible time. The economic impact of the approaching war was already being felt throughout the empire. The trade that had been the foundation of our prosperity was grinding to a halt as merchants fled to safer regions. The caravans that had once crossed the Sahara in regular processions became fewer and smaller. The markets of Timbuktu and Gao, once bustling with activity, were showing signs of decline as people prepared for the worst. The psychological impact was perhaps even more serious. The confidence that had characterized our empire during its golden age was beginning to erode. The sense of invincibility that had sustained us through decades of expansion and prosperity was being replaced by uncertainty and fear. The future that had once seemed bright and limitless now appeared clouded with danger. I spent my days in the imperial archives, copying the most important documents and preparing them for transport to safer locations. The manuscripts that contained the accumulated wisdom of our civilization, the chronicles that recorded our achievements, the treaties that defined our relationships with other powers, all had to be preserved against the possibility that our capital might fall. It was heartbreaking work, like preparing for one's own funeral while still alive. The scholars of Timbuktu were engaged in similar efforts, packing their precious books and manuscripts for evacuation to the south. The great library of Sankor, which had been the pride of our empire and the envy of the Islamic world, was being systematically emptied as its treasures were hidden in remote locations where the invaders might not find them. The university that had attracted students from across Africa was closing its doors, its professors fleeing with their most valuable texts. The preparations for defense were proceeding as rapidly as possible, but they were hampered by the very prosperity that had made us a target. The cities that had grown rich on trade were reluctant to spend their wealth on fortifications. The The merchants who had profited from peace were hesitant to support military preparations that might disrupt their business. The populations that had known only prosperity were struggling to understand the magnitude of the threat they faced. The fortress of Timbuktu, that great center of learning and commerce, was being transformed into a military stronghold. The walls were strengthened with whatever materials could be found. The gates were reinforced with iron and stone. The towers were equipped with the few cannon we possessed. But the preparations could not hide the fact that the city was designed for trade, not for war. Its open layout, its commercial districts, its libraries and schools, all made it vulnerable to the kind of assault that modern warfare could deliver. The army that was being assembled to meet the Moroccan threat was impressive in its size and courage but troubling in its obsolescence. The cavalry that had dominated the battlefields of West Africa would be helpless against artillery and firearms. The infantry that had conquered kingdoms would be vulnerable to enemies who could kill from distances that made traditional weapons useless. The fortifications that had protected our cities for centuries would crumble before modern siege techniques. The final diplomatic missions sent to Morocco returned with the confirmation of our worst fears. The Sultan was determined to proceed with his plans. The economic arguments, the religious appeals, the offers of increased tribute, all had been rejected. The die was cast, the decision was made. War was inevitable. The Askia spent his final days in a frenzy of activity, visiting the frontier regions, inspecting the defenses, consulting with his military commanders. But I could see in his eyes the same knowledge that haunted my own thoughts. We were about to face an enemy whose advantages might prove insurmountable. The empire that had seemed so powerful, so enduring, so blessed by God and history, was about to face its greatest trial. The young men who had grown up in peace were now training for war, learning to use weapons they had never seen before, preparing to face an enemy whose methods were alien to everything they had been taught. The scholars who had spent their lives in libraries were now studying military treatises, trying to understand the new forms of warfare that were transforming the world. The merchants who had known only prosperity were now hiding their wealth, preparing for a future that might hold nothing but loss and destruction. The river continued to flow, as it always had, carrying with it the hopes and fears of a people who had built their lives beside its waters. But now the water seemed to whisper warnings, to carry omens of the storm that was approaching from the north. The golden age was ending, and the time of trial was about to begin. The final months before the battle were marked by a strange combination of frantic preparation and fatalistic acceptance. Everyone understood what was coming, but no one was sure we could prevent it. The empire that had seemed so stable, so permanent, so blessed by divine favor, was revealing itself to be more fragile than anyone had imagined. The last harvest before the war was gathered with unusual care, as if the grain itself might be needed to sustain the empire through the dark days ahead. The last caravans to cross the Sahara in peace brought news of the Moroccan preparations, confirming what we already knew. The enemy was coming, and they were better prepared than we were. The final councils of war were held in the palace of Gao, where the Askia and his advisors debated strategy and tactics with the urgency of men who knew their time was running out. The decisions made in those meetings would determine the fate of everything we had built over the past century. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but there was no choice but to bear it. The army that marched out to meet the Moroccan invasion was the largest force our empire had ever assembled. It included warriors from every province, soldiers from every ethnic group, men who spoke a dozen different languages but were united by their loyalty to the Songhai crown. They were brave, they were skilled, they were determined to defend their homeland against the invaders. But as I watched them march past the palace, their spears glinting in the sun, their banners streaming in the wind, I could not shake the feeling that I was witnessing the end of an era. These men were the products of a military tradition that had served us well for centuries, but they were about to face challenges that no previous generation had encountered. The battlefield that had been chosen for the confrontation was a plain near the village of Tondabai, north of Gao, where the terrain favored neither side. It was here that the fate of our empire would be decided, where the clash between ancient and modern, between tradition and innovation, between the medieval and the early modern worlds would reach its climax. The night before the battle, I stood on the walls of Gao and looked north toward the enemy camp. In the distance, I could see the fires of the Moroccan army, thousands of points of light that seemed to flicker like stars fallen to earth. Between us lay the darkness of the desert, but also the darkness of uncertainty, the unknown future that would be determined by the events of the coming day. The river flowed past the city as it always had, carrying with it the accumulated memories of all who had lived beside its waters. The hippos called from the shallows, their voices echoing across the water like the voices of the ancestors warning us of the trials ahead. The night birds cried from the reed beds, their calls sounding like laments for the age that was ending. I thought of all the rulers who had stood where I stood, all the scribes who had recorded the events of their times, all the people who had looked to the future with hope and confidence. They had built something magnificent, something that had seemed destined to endure forever. But the river had taught me that nothing endures forever, that all things flow, that even the mightiest empires must eventually face the test of time. The water moves slowly tonight, carrying with it the memory of those final days when we stood on the edge of destiny. The river remembers everything, and tonight, it remembers the moment when the golden age of Songhai came to an end, when the old world gave way to the new, when the sound of gunfire echoed across the desert for the first time, announcing the beginning of a new era in the history of Africa. Tomorrow, the battle would be fought. Tomorrow, the fate of our empire would be decided. Tomorrow, the future would be written in blood and gunpowder on the sands of Tondabai. But tonight, in this last moment of the old world, I write these words by the light of oil lamps, preserving the memory of what we were, what we achieved, what we lost. The river flows on, as it always has, carrying our story toward the sea, toward the future, toward the judgment of history. The empire of Songhai, that great creation of African genius and Islamic faith, that bridge between the ancient and the modern, that jewel of the Western Sudan, was about to face its final test. Win or lose, nothing would ever be the same again. The age of innocence was ending, and the age of gunpowder was about to begin.